the gavel and the grin. The courtroom doors groaned open, their burnished brass handles catching the cold gleam of the overhead lights. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery as spectators, mostly jaded journalists, a sprinkling of the defendant's kin, and the habitually idle, found their places. Judge Theodore Thompson, his visage permanently creased in a sardonic expression, entered with a flourish, the folds of his ebony robe swirling in his wake. He mounted the dais with the practiced grace of a veteran actor taking the stage. Thompson scanned the room, his gaze momentarily fixed on a young woman gnawing at her nails in the front row. He exhaled, the sound rebounding slightly in the lofty space. "Let's commence," he declared, his voice a raspy drawl that nevertheless commanded attention. Case 23B478, State vs. Johnson. Mr. Peterson, are we prepared to proceed? A public defender, looking haggard, his cravat askew and his satchel overflowing with documents, rose slowly. "We are, Your Honor." The matter was distressingly commonplace. A certain Mr. Johnson, cadaverous and with eyes perpetually inflamed, stood accused of purloining a loaf of bread and a tin of beans from a local market. When questioned, Johnson mumbled about hunger and unemployment, a recurring lament in this metropolis, where the chasm between affluence and poverty seemed to deepen daily. Judge Thompson listened with detached amusement as the prosecution laid out its case, a monotonous parade of security camera footage and eyewitness accounts. He reclined in his chair, tenting his fingers, his eyes half shuttered. The whole exercise felt futile. Johnson was patently culpable, driven to petty larceny by want. But the law reigned supreme, and Thompson, however disillusioned, was its instrument. "Mr. Peterson," Thompson intoned once the prosecution concluded. "Do you have aught to add?" Peterson, looking even more vanquished than his client, got to his feet and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we concede that Mr. Johnson appropriated the items in question. However, we submit that mitigating circumstances exist. Mr. Johnson has been out of work for half a year, lacks family support in this city, and was, to put it plainly, starving." Thompson arched a brow. "So you invoke necessity? That his violation of the law was justified by hunger?" "Not justified, Your Honor," Peterson clarified, "but perhaps deserving of clemency. We implore the court to consider the circumstances and to offer compassion." Thompson emitted a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Compassion? Mr. Peterson, this is a tribunal, not a charitable institution. The law is immutable. Mr. Johnson is culpable. I find him guilty. 30 days in the county lockup. Next case." As the bailiff escorted Johnson away, his shoulders bowed in defeat, a disturbance erupted near the entrance. Voices escalated, a door slammed, and an air of pandemonium permeated the chamber. Thompson frowned, his carefully constructed veneer of indifference cracking. "What's the commotion?" he demanded, his voice sharp as a tack. The bailiff, a brawny man named Davis, rushed to the bench, his face flushed. "Your Honor, we have a situation. A new detainee is creating a disruption. He refuses to cooperate." "Refuses to cooperate?" Thompson echoed, a note of irritation edging his tone. "The charge?" "Assault, Your Honor," Davis responded. "He engaged in fisticuffs with another inmate during processing." Thompson sighed audibly. "Just what I needed. Bring him forth." Davis hesitated. "Your Honor, he's somewhat imposing. And he's demanded to speak with you specifically." Thompson's eyebrows shot skyward. "Me? Why would he wish to speak with me? I've never laid eyes on this individual before. He claims he possesses information pertinent to a prior case over which you presided, Your Honor. Something about a travesty of justice." Thompson's face clouded over. "A travesty of justice? Is that the prevailing parlance? Everyone's a martyr, everyone has a justification. Davis, simply bring him in. I shall handle him." Davis nodded and hastened back towards the entrance. Moments later he reappeared, laboring to contain a man several inches taller and substantially more muscular than himself. The man's attire was disheveled and soiled, his hair a riotous tangle, and his face bore testament to a recent brawl. But it was his gaze that snagged Thompson's attention. They were sharp, probing, and filled with a defiance that bordered on zealotry. "Release me, you oaf," the man rumbled, his voice a low growl. "I have words for the judge, and I refuse to be frog-marched like some common felon." Davis finally managed to haul the man to the front of the room and deposit him roughly before the bench. "This is Marcus Bell, Your Honor," he announced, panting. "Charged with assault." Marcus Bell glared at Davis, then fixed his attention on Judge Thompson. He stood erect, despite his unkempt state, and met the judge's gaze squarely. There was something unnervingly familiar about him, a nascent recognition that Thompson struggled to grasp. "Marcus Bell," Thompson articulated, his voice carefully devoid of inflection. "And what precisely is it you wish to convey to me, Mr. Bell? I trust it warrants the disruption you've caused." Marcus Bell drew a deep breath, his chest expanding. "It does, Your Honor. It pertains to the case of Emily Carter, accused of corporate espionage 3 years hence. A case you oversaw, Your Honor. A case where an innocent woman was unjustly condemned." Thompson felt a knot constrict in his gut. The Carter case. It had been a celebrated affair, involving millions and accusations of perfidy within a major tech conglomerate. He recalled the pressures he was under to reach a guilty verdict, the whispers in the halls, the calls from influential figures. Emily Carter had been convicted, sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. He had regarded the case as closed. "Mr. Bell," Thompson said, his voice turning flinty, "I advise you to weigh your words carefully. The Carter case was meticulously investigated, and the evidence was irrefutable. Ms. Carter was found guilty by a jury of her peers. The evidence was manufactured, Your Honor," Marcus Bell retorted, his voice ringing with conviction. "The jury was deceived. Emily Carter was set up." Thompson leaned forward, his eyes narrowed to slits. "Set up? And what proof do you possess to substantiate such an absurd allegation?" "I have information, Your Honor," Bell replied. "Information that attests to Emily Carter's innocence. Information that implicates the actual perpetrators of the crime." "And whence did you acquire this information, Mr. Bell?" Thompson inquired, his tone laced with incredulity. "From the prison grapevine? From some disgruntled ex-employee seeking vengeance?" Marcus Bell smirked, a fleeting expression that might have been amusement dancing in his eyes. "Suffice it to say I have sources, Your Honor. Sources that are both credible and well-informed." Thompson stared at Bell, attempting to assess his veracity. He detected intelligence, resolve, and a hint of something more, something elusive. He also perceived a man clearly accustomed to battling for his convictions, irrespective of the odds. "Mr. Bell," Thompson said after a prolonged pause, "I appreciate your fervor. But I fear I cannot simply accept your pronouncements. You are a convicted felon, presently facing charges for assault. Your credibility is, shall we say, less than pristine." "I understand your skepticism, Your Honor," Bell replied. "But I'm not asking you to take my word as gospel. I'm asking you to investigate. To examine the evidence with an unbiased eye. To entertain the possibility that you may have erred." Thompson scoffed derisively. "Erred? I do not err, Mr. Bell. I adhere to the law, I evaluate the evidence, and I deliver a judgment. That is my function." "And what if the law is flawed, Your Honor?" Bell challenged, his voice escalating. "What if the evidence is spurious? What if you are consigning innocent individuals to incarceration?" Thompson slammed his gavel on the bench, the sound reverberating through the chamber. "Enough! I will not condone such disrespect. Mr. Bell, you are in contempt of court. I sentence you to an additional 30 days in the county jail." Bell did not flinch. He simply fixed Thompson with a stare, his eyes blazing with intensity. "You can sentence me to a century, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and low. "But it will not alter the truth. Emily Carter is innocent, and you know it." Thompson felt a shiver course down his spine. He didn't know it, naturally. He couldn't know it. He had obeyed the law, he had fulfilled his duty. But something about Bell's pronouncements, about his unshakable certainty, made him question everything. "Davis," Thompson commanded, his voice barely audible. "Return Mr. Bell to his cell. And ensure he causes no further disturbance." Davis nodded and escorted Bell away, but Thompson's gaze remained riveted on the departing figure. He couldn't dispel the sensation that he had just encountered something momentous, something that could potentially dismantle everything he thought he knew about the justice system, about himself. As the courtroom emptied, Thompson sat alone on the bench, the burden of his responsibilities weighing heavily upon him. He glanced down at his hands, the hands that had wielded the gavel, the hands that had condemned countless individuals to confinement. Were they the hands of justice, or the hands of blind compliance? He reflected on Emily Carter, a young woman with a promising future, now languishing in a prison cell. He recalled her tearful protestations of innocence, her desperate pleas to convince him that she had been framed. He had dismissed her as a liar, a desperate criminal attempting to evade the repercussions of her actions. But what if she had been truthful? He gazed up at the vacant courtroom, the silence amplifying his doubts. The gavel lay on the bench before him, a symbol of his power, his authority. But now, it felt like a weight, a reminder of the immense onus he carried. He arose, walked to the window, and surveyed the cityscape below. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the avenues. It was a city of aspirations and letdowns, of equity and inequity, of optimism and despair. And he, Judge Theodore Thompson, was one of its custodians, one of its arbiters. He faced a decision. He could disregard Marcus Bell's assertions, dismiss him as a misguided agitator, and persist on his path of cynical detachment. Or he could embrace the risk, challenge the established order, and delve into a case that he had long relegated to the past. He knew which path offered the least resistance. But he also understood that often, the correct path was the most arduous. He returned to the bench, picked up the gavel, and held it in his palm. It felt heavier than he remembered. He reached his decision. He would investigate. He would unearth the truth, whatever the cost. He would not allow an innocent woman to languish in prison. He would not permit the scales of justice to remain askew. He settled down, powered on his computer, and began to seek out information on the Emily Carter case. As the screen flickered to life, casting an ethereal glow on his face, he felt a nascent hope, a flicker of something dormant for years. The potential for redemption. Inmate on deck. The courtroom's buzzing lights cast a sickly pallor, each flicker amplifying the unease twisting in Judge Thompson's gut. The morning had been a parade of the mundane, DUIs and petty thefts, each case a blur, the rulings feeling less like justice dispensed, more like paperwork shuffled. The Carter case, a festering memory he thought cauterized, had been ripped open anew by Bell, this self-anointed savior of the unjustly accused, with the force of a sudden squall. He observed Bell's approach to the lectern, an awkward frame swimming in the orange fabric. But Bell's eyes blazed, a fervor that belied his ungainly walk. The zeal of conviction, Thompson mused, or perhaps the raw desperation of a drowning man clutching at straws. "Mr. Bell," Thompson announced, his voice crisply amplified, each syllable distinct. "You've requested to address the court regarding the Carter matter. I must remind you that you are currently facing assault charges, and this court will not become a stage for specious claims." Bell's Adam's apple danced as he swallowed. He adjusted the microphone, the resultant shriek sending a jolt through the gallery. "Your Honor," he started, his voice a shaky reed. "I understand my predicament. But Emily Carter is the reason I'm here, the reason I acted as I did." Thompson leaned back, face an unreadable mask. He steepled his fingers, a gesture that often rattled those standing before him. "Cut to the chase, Mr. Bell. We have a docket to manage." Bell fumbled through the papers he'd brought, a small avalanche cascading onto the floor. He colored as he bent to retrieve them, embarrassment etched on his face. Thompson fought back a sigh. This was precisely the torment of self-representation, a clogged system, wasted time, and a profound ignorance of process. "I've been researching the Carter case," Bell stammered, finally securing a document. He brandished it, his hand trembling like a leaf. "And I've uncovered discrepancies, overlooked evidence, inconsistencies in testimony." Thompson arched a brow, a silent challenge. "Discrepancies? Inconsistencies? Mr. Bell, the Carter case underwent exhaustive investigation and a meticulous trial. The jury returned a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Are you alleging a systemic corruption, including my own involvement, to condemn an innocent woman?" Bell's eyes grew wide. "No, Your Honor, not corruption. I simply believe mistakes were made. Key details were overlooked. Like the forensic audit. It wasn't properly examined." He stumbled over. Forensic audit. The phrase sounding clumsy and unfamiliar on his tongue. Thompson felt a fleeting prick of pity, quickly smothered. The man was floundering in a sea of legal concepts he only vaguely grasped. "And which specific aspect of this forensic audit do you find so problematic, Mr. Bell?" Thompson inquired, his tone laced with disdain. He anticipated the answer. Bell wouldn't have a clue. He was merely regurgitating lines from a legal drama. Bell hesitated, his gaze flitting about the room like a trapped bird. His lips parted, closed, then opened once more. "Well, the figures. They simply don't align." A current of amusement rippled through the gallery. A court reporter stifled a chuckle. Even the bailiff, a man hardened by years of witnessing the absurd, betrayed a hint of a smile. Thompson permitted himself a tight, mirthless smile. "The figures don't align? That's your legal argument, Mr. Bell? Perhaps you should have consulted an accountant before resorting to assault in the name of this purported injustice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Bell, with all due respect, and its supply is meager, this court is not a playground for amateur investigators. The law is a complex tapestry, demanding years of diligent study and practical expertise. Your research borders on insulting to the dedicated professionals who champion justice." Thompson leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "Furthermore, your actions, assaulting an employee of Carter Corp., under the pretense of some deluded vigilantism, are utterly reprehensible. This court will not condone such behavior. You are wasting the court's time." Bell stood rigid, his face burning with mortification. He gripped the papers, his knuckles bone white. He resembled a trapped creature, cornered and terrified. "But Emily Carter is innocent," he mumbled, his voice lost to the hum of the room. "I know it." Thompson sighed, a sound of exaggerated exasperation. "Mr. Bell, the jury has rendered its verdict. Ms. Carter stands convicted. This court is bound by the law, not by your sentiments." He glanced at the wall clock. "I've indulged you sufficiently. I am finding you in contempt for frivolous and unsubstantiated claims that waste the court's resources. 30 days added to your sentence. Bailiff, return Mr. Bell to his holding cell." As the bailiff approached, Bell's composure crumbled. "You're committing a grave error," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's innocent. You must heed me." The bailiff gripped Bell's arm, leading him away. Bell resisted for a moment, his eyes fixed on Thompson. "You'll see," he shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You'll all see. Emily Carter is innocent." The bailiff tightened his hold, and Bell was dragged out of view, his pleas fading into the distance. Thompson watched his departure, a strange cocktail of emotions swirling within. Relief that the farce had concluded, annoyance at the interruption, and something more. A persistent disquiet that he struggled to define. The gallery erupted in murmurs, the tension released by Bell's outburst. Thompson struck his gavel, restoring order. "Next case," he announced, his voice flat. He picked up the file, a simple public intoxication charge. Another day, another series of minor transgressions, another string of judgments feeling increasingly hollow. But as he read, his mind wandered back to Bell, to his impassioned plea, to that burning conviction in his eyes. He conjured the Carter case, the pressure from partners at his previous firm, the endless hours dissecting documents, the pervasive sense of inevitability that had cloaked the trial. He'd been so sure then, so unwavering in his belief that justice was being served. Now, retrospect painted a different picture, a nagging feeling that something had been amiss. Something overlooked. He closed the file, his hand betraying a slight tremor. He knew he shouldn't. It was futile, an exercise in needless self-doubt. But he couldn't resist. He had to know. He had to see if there was even a sliver of truth buried in Bell's claims. He buzzed his clerk. "Retrieve the complete file on the Carter case," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything. Every document, every transcript, every item of evidence." The clerk, taken aback, hesitated. "But Your Honor, that case is closed. It has been years." "Just get the file," Thompson insisted, his voice firm. "And ensure it's complete. I intend to review it, thoroughly." He hung up, a wave of dread crashing over him. Opening that file felt like opening a vault of secrets. He might not like what he found lurking within. And if he did unearth something, if he were to discover that an innocent woman had been unjustly condemned, he had no idea what he would do. The lights buzzed, the sound no longer monotonous, but a stark, low drone of premonition. He stared at the blank wall, the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future bearing down on him. He sensed that his quiet, predictable existence teetered on the precipice of upheaval. All thanks to some loud-mouthed inmate. A moment to breathe. A film of perspiration slicked Marcus's back, a stark reminder of his recent audacity. Facing the judge, the gatekeeper of his fate, he delivered a rambling, fervent, and likely incoherent defense for a stranger, all on a hunch and the suspect notes of a discredited accountant. He imagined the coarse fabric of an inmate's uniform clinging to him, the guard's gazes like twin spotlights. He swallowed, a bitter tang of trepidation coating his mouth. He desperately needed breathing room, a moment to regroup and salvage his disastrous courtroom gambit. "Your Honor," Marcus croaked, his voice rough. "The court's indulgence, please. I request a brief recess. I seem to have mislaid some vital documents related to my arguments." A grimace tightened his features, a flimsy excuse, transparent as cellophane, yet the only one he could conjure. Judge Thompson regarded him with a look blending incredulity and an unreadable element. The courtroom hushed, the silence broken only by the measured pulse of an antique clock, each tick a stark countdown against Marcus's dwindling composure. Thompson's expression was a battleground of conflicting emotions. Annoyance tightened the corners of his mouth, and deep furrows etched themselves around his eyes. Yet there existed a spark of hesitation, a fragile dance beneath the surface. Marcus seized on that flicker, clinging to it like a lifeline. At long last, the judge released a sigh, heavy with years of legal proceedings and strained patience. He pinched the bridge of his nose, leaving a transient crimson mark. "Mr. Bell," Thompson began, his voice laced with weariness. "Your conduct today borders on the theatrical. You've displayed a flagrant disregard for this court's procedures, and you've consumed an inordinate amount of judicial time. But," his gaze sharpened, "I'm also aware of the severity of the charges against you. While I find your assertions regarding the Carter case highly improbable, I am not entirely deaf to your situation." Marcus held his breath, a fragile bloom of hope unfurling within him. "Therefore," Thompson continued, "I will grant a recess. 15 minutes. Employ that time judiciously, Mr. Bell. I anticipate a more cogent presentation upon our return." A sharp crack echoed as the gavel struck the sound block. "This court is recessed." The guards, previously coiled and ready, eased their stances, though their eyes never left Marcus. As they escorted him back to the holding cell, he felt the weight of their distrust, the implicit accusation that he was merely a charlatan attempting to manipulate the system. The holding cell was a cheerless cubicle, devoid of windows and saturated with the smells of disinfectant and stagnant despair. Marcus slumped onto the rigid metal bench, burying his face in his hands. 15 minutes, a quarter of an hour to unravel the mess he'd created, to somehow forge a defense that wouldn't plunge him even deeper into trouble. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the confining space, the creeping dread, the burgeoning panic that threatened to drown him. He conjured an image of Emily Carter, a name encountered only weeks prior, a face glimpsed in grainy news images. What impulse had driven him to risk everything on her behalf? It extended beyond just justice, although that was a component. It was tied to something more profound, something intimately personal. It was entwined with his history, his errors, his fervent desire for atonement. He dedicated years to evading his past, cloaking it in layers of indifference and cynicism. But something in Emily's story had resonated, had pierced his carefully constructed defenses and reawakened something long dormant. Flashes of his own trial resurfaced, years prior, a hazy montage of legalese and indifferent faces. He'd been young, terrified, and utterly isolated. He hadn't grasped the intricacies of the system, hadn't known how to advocate for himself. He'd meekly resigned to his sentence, convinced he deserved whatever punishment meted out. But Emily's case felt different. He instinctively knew that something was amiss, profoundly wrong. And for the first time in years, he felt compelled to act, to advocate for another, to attempt to rectify an injustice that had lingered for too long. His eyes snapped open, his gaze hardening. Time was short. He needed a strategy, a design, something beyond mere faith and reckless claims. He needed a way to convince Judge Thompson that Emily Carter deserved a second consideration, that the forensic audit contained disparities requiring scrutiny. He dredged up the audit report, the numerical data swirling before his eyes, the red flags that had jumped out even with his limited knowledge of the subject. He pictured specific figures, the irregularities flagged by Bell's frantic scrawls. He closed his eyes again, striving to rebuild the report in his memory, to recall the specifics that had felt so vital, so damning. He focused, dismissing the fear and anxiety, concentrating on the task at hand. Each passing minute felt like a ticking bomb. He paced the cramped cell, his mind racing, piecing together fragments of information, constructing arguments, attempting to predict the judge's reactions. He knew he was walking a precarious tightrope, teetering on the brink of disaster. One false step, one ill-chosen word, and he could plunge into the abyss. He couldn't afford to retreat now. He had ventured too far, risked too much. He must see this through, for Emily's sake, and for the sake of his own buried conscience. He paused, a sudden idea illuminating his thoughts. The auditor. He recalled Bell mentioning the auditor, a former employee, ostracized for his accusations. What if he could locate him? What if he could convince him to testify, to substantiate Bell's claims? It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but the only viable lead. Somehow, he must contact him, persuade him to come forward. How? He was confined, lacking access to a phone, a computer, any means of communication. His gaze darted around the cell, searching for any potential tool, any source of aid. His eyes landed on a small, corroded vent in the corner. It was partially obscured by a dislodged metal grate. A plan began to take shape, a risky, audacious scheme that could either redeem him or condemn him outright. He approached the vent, his heart pounding. He cautiously tested the grate. It could be removed, but required some effort. He surveyed the cell again, confirming his solitude. Then, inhaling deeply, he began to pry at the grate, using his fingernails as levers, his muscles straining. The metal emitted a piercing screech, the sound amplified in the small space. He paused, listening for any indication of discovery. The guards remained engrossed, their voices muffled. He persisted, his fingers throbbing and bleeding, his resolve powered by a desperate hope. At length, the grate detached, falling to the floor with a muted thud. He peered into the vent, his eyes struggling in the gloom. It was a narrow passage, barely large enough to navigate, but a potential route to freedom, a chance to locate the auditor, to demonstrate Emily Carter's innocence. It was a reckless move, a violation of the law, a betrayal of trust. Yet he saw no alternative. He had to commit, staking everything on this single, desperate opportunity. He took another breath, bracing himself for the ordeal ahead. Then, with a silent vow, he squeezed into the vent, dissolving into the darkness. Cool metal pressed against his skin, the scent of dust and decay filling his lungs. He was alone, adrift, with only his conviction to guide him. He began to crawl, inching forward, deeper into the unknown. The road ahead was veiled, beset with danger, but turning back was no longer an option. The decision was made, and he must see it through, regardless of the price. He advanced, propelled by an unwavering belief in the possibility of righting wrongs, in the power of redemption, and in the hope that he could truly effect change, one agonizing movement at a time. The air grew heavy with the aroma of mildew and forgotten stories as each creak and groan in the aging structure heightened his feeling of solitude, yet still, he continued, spurred by a driving force he could no longer resist. From street to scholar. The air in the vent was tighter than he'd anticipated. Gritting his teeth against the confinement, Marcus edged forward, the corrugated metal a rasp against his skin. Sparse light from Emily's cell illuminated swirling particles of grime. He had to push on, reach the auditor. Emily's freedom hinged on it. The biting chill of the steel was a sharp contrast to the inferno of resolve blazing within him. The judge's condescending smirk swam into focus, the bored disinterest of the bailiffs a familiar tableau. But this time, the apathy stung differently. This time, he was knee-deep in the fight, not a mere observer. He crawled onward, the present dissolving into a kaleidoscope of recollections, each fragment as piercing as shattered crystal. A younger version of himself emerged, not the callous man now navigating this grimy tunnel, but a boy whose eyes shimmered with nascent fury, hunched beneath the skeletal beams of a condemned building, poring over a dilapidated law book. *****. The air lay stagnant, thick with the acrid tang of stale urine and decay. Rain hammered against the boarded windows of the derelict factory, a relentless tattoo mirroring the frantic thrum in young Marcus's chest. 12 years old, lean as a feral dog, he possessed a fierce, unyielding determination. Teetering stacks of salvaged legal texts surrounded him, rescued from dumpsters and the forgotten corners of libraries. Each page held untold value, each paragraph a revelation. He consumed them with a hunger that transcended physical need. A callous finger traced faded ink, whispering archaic phrases, habeas corpus, res ipsa loquitur, mens rea. They resonated as more than mere words. They were instruments, weapons forged against the injustices that flourished in the surrounding streets. Marcus absorbed a harsh lesson early: the world wasn't equitable. He'd witnessed good souls crushed beneath a system seemingly designed to shield the powerful while punishing the weak. His mother, a gentle woman etched with hardship, had been one of those casualties. He recalled the arrival of the eviction notice, its stark white form shattering their already precarious stability. The landlord, his features as unforgiving as granite, showed no compassion. Within days, their meager possessions lay piled on the curb. That day ignited a fire within Marcus. Lacking money or influence, he possessed intellect. He vowed to wield it to protect the unprotected. He began small, mediating minor skirmishes among neighborhood children, challenging unfair penalties imposed by shopkeepers. His sharp mind and unwavering belief in fairness proved surprisingly effective, often disarming those who underestimated him. The factory served as his sanctuary. He'd stumbled upon it accidentally, a hidden refuge amidst urban blight. The dripping roof and shattered panes were a small price to pay for the solitude and the meager light it afforded, allowing him to pursue his solitary studies. He taught himself to decipher the intricate legal jargon, aided by tattered dictionaries and encyclopedias. His memory was a marvel, enabling him to absorb copious amounts of data with phenomenal speed. He could recite entire sections of the penal code verbatim, his mind a vast, intricately woven legal archive. He practiced arguments before a fractured mirror, pacing the dust-laden floor, refining his burgeoning skills. He envisioned himself in court, championing the innocent, challenging corruption. He would become their voice, their shield, their unwavering advocate. One day, a gruff old janitor named Mr. Peterson discovered him in the factory. Peterson, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, initially regarded the young trespasser with suspicion. But witnessing Marcus's relentless dedication, his unquenchable thirst for knowledge, Peterson softened. Peterson became an unexpected guide, bringing him lukewarm coffee and stale crusts, offering enigmatic counsel gleaned from a life of hard knocks. He also unveiled the treasures of the public library, a repository of knowledge that broadened Marcus's horizons immeasurably. Quick cuts. Barely a teen, Marcus hunched over law texts in the library's hallowed quiet, brow furrowed. Marcus debating legal intricacies with older students, his voice resonant and confident, his points precise. Marcus volunteering at a legal aid clinic, assisting lawyers with research and composing briefs. Marcus triumphing in a mock trial, his closing statements electrifying the room, leaving the judges astounded. Marcus accepting a scholarship to a prestigious law school, his eyes blazing with ambition. But fate, it appeared, held a different hand. The scholarship represented a lifeline, a chance to transcend the cycle of poverty and violence that had defined his early life. He immersed himself in his studies with intensified zeal, excelling in every subject. Graduation at the apex of his class seemed inevitable, paving the way for a dazzling future. Then came the night that irrevocably altered his trajectory. He was walking home from the library, his mind absorbed in legal theories and constitutional principles, when a scream ripped through the night. A young woman was under attack in a shadowed alleyway. Without a second's hesitation, Marcus intervened. He fought off the assailant, rescuing the woman from potential harm. During the struggle, the attacker brandished a knife. Marcus managed to disarm him, but not before the assailant suffered a severe wound. Sirens wailed, lights pulsed as the police arrived. The attacker, a known gang affiliate with a lengthy criminal record, claimed self-defense. The woman, traumatized and confused, provided a conflicting narrative. Marcus faced arrest, charged with aggravated assault. His overworked public defender viewed him as another faceless case. He urged Marcus to plead guilty, accept a deal. It offered the simplest resolution, the path of least resistance, he argued. But Marcus refused. He was innocent. He had acted in defense of another, to protect a human life. He would not concede guilt for an act of selfless intervention. The trial unfolded as a travesty. The prosecution portrayed Marcus as a violent thug, a menace to society. The judge, unyielding and severe, seemed biased from the outset. The woman, intimidated by gang influence, retracted her initial testimony. Despite Marcus's eloquent self-representation, his passionate appeals for justice, the jury returned a guilty verdict. He received a 5-year sentence. The sentence felt like treachery, a cruel jest. He devoted himself to upholding the law, to defending the vulnerable. Now, he was being punished for it. His aspirations shattered, his optimism extinguished, Marcus passed through the prison gates, a broken spirit. The once promising legal mind, the champion of the underdog, was reduced to another number, swallowed by the mass of the incarcerated. Prison proved a brutal, dehumanizing experience. He encountered violence, corruption, and profound despair. He learned to survive, to construct emotional armor against the constant barrage of negativity. He clung to sanity through continued study, concealing law books beneath his mattress, devouring them in the cell's dim glow. He nursed the faint hope that one day, he could leverage his knowledge to champion justice, to reclaim his lost dignity. But years eroded his spirit. The ceaseless struggle, the absence of hope, the feeling of entrapment, all took their toll. Cynicism bloomed, disillusionment hardened, and he became convinced that the system itself was inherently corrupt, that justice was a delusion. His release from prison marked him as a changed man. He emerged stripped of innocence, idealism, and belief in the system. He drifted, unable to find a foothold in the world. He was an outcast, an ex-convict, forever branded by his past. He tried to suppress his legal knowledge, to bury his dreams. But the law, like an unquiet specter, pursued him. He could not outrun it. It had become inseparable from his very essence. Then, Emily Carter entered his life. The recollection dissolved, leaving Marcus gulping for air in the cramped confines of the vent. Dust irritated his eyes, metal scraped at his flesh, but the inner fire now burned with incandescent intensity. He understood now. He wasn't simply trying to exonerate Emily Carter. He was striving to redeem himself. He sought to prove he wasn't defined by his past, to discover lasting meaning in his existence. He propelled himself forward, fueled by renewed purpose. He would locate the auditor. He would expose the truth. He would shield Emily Carter from a fate akin to his own. He arrived at a junction in the vent, a fork in the grimy tunnel. He stilled, listening intently. The distant thrum of machinery, the garbled voices of guards, reached his ears. He needed to discern the correct route. Drawing a deep breath, he veered left, crawling toward the sound. Unsure of what awaited, he was ready. No longer the shell of a man who'd entered these walls, he was Marcus Bell, the self-taught prodigy, prepared to fight for what was right. He emerged from the vent into a small, poorly illuminated storage space. Shelves filled the walls, piled high with containers and files. The air hung heavy with the combined scents of dust and mold. His gaze swept the room, assessing every nook and cranny. He needed an escape route, a means of reaching the auditor. Then he spotted it. A door, partially concealed behind a stack of boxes. He hastened towards it, his pulse pounding in his ears. He grasped the knob, his hand trembling with anticipation. Inhaling sharply, he twisted. The door swung inward, exposing a narrow corridor. He stepped from the storage room, into the very core of the prison. He'd drawn one step closer to his objective. But he was equally aware that he'd come one step closer to capture. The stakes had never been higher. He needed to proceed with caution, with intellect, and above all, with speed. He crept soundlessly along the corridor, his senses heightened. He was now a fugitive, an outlaw. But he was also a man possessed by purpose. And he would not be deterred. The recess reckoning. The clang of the recess bell sliced through the courtroom's strained silence, a rude awakening. Ignoring the ingrained curiosity in the faces around him, Marcus gathered his scattered notes. The bailiff's gravelly voice trailed after him. 10 minutes, Bell? And keep it clean! A ghost of a smile flickered across Marcus's face, failing to reach his eyes as he made his way to the holding cell. The cramped, windowless space reeked faintly of antiseptic and day-old coffee. Concrete chilled Marcus's bare feet as he paced, re-examining his frantic scribbles, a chaotic blend of citations, statutes, and his pointed critiques of the prosecution's shaky foundation. Improvisation fueled by instinct and half-remembered legal precepts had gotten him this far, but he desperately needed something tangible, a bedrock principle to buttress his challenge to Emily Carter's fate. He needed a binding precedent, a legal North Star. He scrubbed at his close-cropped hair, frustration etching itself onto his features. The prosecution's entire case was a teetering edifice built on circumstantial whispers and a tainted confession, vulnerable to the slightest gale. He had to be that gale, a legal tempest of reason. A gentle rap vibrated through the stale air. Marcus stiffened, his spine instinctively straightening. Bell? A woman's voice, tentative yet steady. Through the narrow portal in the steel door, he saw a young woman cradling a stack of documents. Evelyn Reed, a court clerk he noticed during the trial, her gaze darting between him and Judge Thompson with a mixture of concern and open inquisitiveness. Suspicion wrestled with nascent hope as he hesitated. What do you want? I was present for the session. She adjusted the papers in her arms. I might possess something that could be advantageous. He unlocked the door, a wedge of light illuminating her face. Her warm brown eyes held an unexpected depth of understanding. Barely older than himself, perhaps mid-20s, she projected an air of practicality and quiet competence. Which is? He asked, his voice carefully modulated. I couldn't help but overhear your line of reasoning, she murmured, dropping her voice low. Your assessment is correct. The case against Emily Carter is unsubstantial. And the confession? Well, let's just acknowledge that the officers involved have a checkered past. Marcus's pulse quickened, a jolt of adrenaline. You're aware of this? I've witnessed. Read things, she revealed, her gaze darting nervously towards the courtroom door. things that instill doubts regarding the ethical composition of the system. She offered the documents towards him. These are pertinent precedents. Instances where analogous confessions were discarded, where indirect evidence was deemed lacking. Ingest them. Employ them. He accepted the papers, his fingers momentarily touching hers. The warmth of her skin was a small but potent spark of human connection in this sterile environment. He scanned the documents, his mind racing. They were precisely the ammunition he needed. "Why are you doing this?" he inquired, unfiltered curiosity coloring his tone. Evelyn sighed, a shadow of world-weariness darkening her expression. "Because it's ethically objectionable." What befell Emily Carter was ethically objectionable. Observing you stand your ground, despite your predicament, instilled hope. The hope that someone still values justice, even if the institution doesn't. He scrutinized her face, searching for any hint of subterfuge. There was none. Only a subtle resolution, a spark of dissidence glinting in her eyes. He believed her. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling shallow yet heartfelt. "Premature gratitude," she demurred, glancing at her watch. 5 minutes remaining. Internalize those precedents, formulate your strategy, and persevere. He nodded, his mind already assembling the pieces. He rapidly skimmed the documents, extracting the vital kernels, etching them into his memory. The precedents were compelling, nearly unassailable. They threatened the very foundation of the prosecution's argument. "One caveat," Evelyn added, her voice barely audible. "Exercise caution. Judge Thompson. He disdains objections. Especially when originating from a source such as you." "Understood," Marcus responded, his gaze hardening. "But intimidation is not an effective deterrent." The recess bell sounded again, its harsh cry signaling the end of their brief interlude. Marcus returned the documents to Evelyn, his gaze unwavering. "I will not forget this assistance," he declared. Evelyn offered a tiny, bolstering smile. "Simply act justly, Belle. That constitutes the entirety." She dissolved back through the doorway, becoming one with the nameless faces of the court personnel. Marcus drew a deep breath, fortifying his inner resolve. A rush of adrenaline coursed through him, a rebirth of purpose. He wasn't solely battling for Emily Carter's freedom anymore. He was fighting for his own soul, for the discarded fragments of his past, for the chance to redefine himself beyond his prior transgressions. He re-entered the courtroom, his posture erect, his head held high. The room hummed with altered energy. The whispers had intensified, the stares sharpening. Judge Thompson held his place on the dais, his expression masked. But Marcus sensed a shift, a faint tightening of his jaw, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. He approached the defense table, his bare feet echoing on the immaculate floor. The smirks of the bailiffs, the scrutinizing glances of the spectators registered only peripherally. He focused on the task ahead, the impending legal confrontation. He stood tall, his gaze locking with Judge Thompson's. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice resonating with authority. "I have acquired critical evidence. Evidence that will highlight the discrepancies rampant within the prosecution's case, and the miscarriage of justice imposed upon Emily Carter." Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the provenance of this so-called evidence, Mr. Bell?" "Irrelevant, Your Honor," Marcus countered, his tone unyielding. "The value lies in the evidence. I request permission to argue my case using these established legal precedents that support my claims." A palpable tension enveloped the courtroom. Judge Thompson drilled Marcus with his gaze, his expression a complex blend of annoyance and reluctant respect. He grasped the danger of Marcus as an opponent, a legal force that could potentially shift the courtroom's tectonic plates. Finally, he delivered his verdict, his voice frigid and carefully measured. "Very well, Mr. Bell. Proceed. But let the court note, any further interruption or specious, frivolous argument shall not be tolerated." Marcus nodded curtly, a confident smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Your Honor. I can assure you, Your Honor, my argument shall be anything but that." He paused briefly, inhaling deeply, collecting his thoughts. Evelyn's parting words reverberated through his mind, "Persevere out there." And that's precisely what he intended to do. He began to speak, his voice ringing through the courtroom. His words were precise, articulate, dissecting the prosecution's argument, using the precedents supplied. His language was charged by a burning passion for justice. He hammered on inconsistencies in the witness accounts, the lack of tangible proof linking Emily Carter to the crime. He highlighted that the prosecution's case was composed of speculation, the coercive tactics used to obtain the confession and prejudice, not facts and evidence. As he continued, the faces of jurors began to change, doubt clouding their features. Even Judge Thompson wore a new look of attention. Marcus knew he was on a difficult path. He was just one man, armed with law and the need for justice. He was determined to fight, expose the truth. He was not just Marcus Bell anymore. He was a force for justice, a champion for the underdog and a beacon of hope. He knew at that moment, he was where he should be. He was going to fight and expose, even if it meant risking everything, until the truth was found. Dismantling the case. Marcus Bell straightened, empowered by the reflected confidence he'd absorbed from Evelyn Reed. The aged documents felt surprisingly warm against his palm, a reassuring weight against the courtroom's frigid atmosphere. He tugged at his tie, the inexpensive material now feeling akin to protective plating. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying a newfound strength. "The prosecution's argument hinges precariously on Ms. Carter's confession, a statement I intend to demonstrate was not only coerced but inadmissible under established legal principles." ADA Sarah Jenkins emitted a derisive snort that cut through the sudden hush. "Mr. Bell, this is redundant. The confession was freely volunteered, witnessed, and signed. It's airtight." She adjusted her precisely tailored suit, a sharp contrast to Marcus's poorly fitting one. Her arrogance hung heavy in the air, a defense against the mere possibility of failure. Marcus disregarded her, his gaze fixed on Judge Thompson, whose features presented an inscrutable facade of judicial impartiality. A fleeting concern arose. Did the judge recall their previous, less than cordial exchange? He banished the thought. Emily's fate hung in the balance, resting squarely on his shoulders. "Airtight, Ms. Jenkins?" Marcus countered, a subtle challenge coloring his tone. "I beg to differ. Let's examine the particulars, shall we? The prosecution conveniently omits Section 349, subsection D of the Criminal Procedure Code, pertaining to the permissible duration of interrogation without legal representation." He paused, noting the fleeting confusion that flickered across Jenkins' brow. He elaborated. "Ms. Carter was detained for 37 hours, a significant 17 hours exceeding the legally mandated limit, before her supposedly voluntary confession was procured. This is a direct violation of the cited section, thereby rendering the confession invalid." He raised the photocopied statute. "Furthermore," he added, turning a page, "the prosecution's reliance on the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine suffers from similar flaws." Jenkins sputtered. "That's preposterous. We possess corroborating evidence. The murder weapon, eyewitness accounts." "Ah, yes, the murder weapon," Marcus interjected, his voice building momentum. "The prosecution alleges the knife discovered near the crime scene belongs to Ms. Carter. However, the forensic analysis, conveniently absent from the prosecution's presentation, reveals only partial fingerprints, none of which conclusively match Ms. Carter's. The prosecution is attempting to construct a case based on conjecture, on shadowy whispers." He moved toward the jury box, his eyes sweeping across their faces. Some appeared apathetic, others showed a flicker of interest. He sensed a shift in the dynamic, a subtle current of doubt diffusing among them. "And the eyewitness account?" Marcus pressed on, his voice gaining volume. "Mr. Henderson, the purported eyewitness, claims to have seen Ms. Carter fleeing the location. However, Mr. Henderson is severely myopic and was not wearing his prescribed lenses at the time of the alleged sighting. His testimony is, at best, unreliable, and perjurious at worst." Jenkins shot to her feet, her face flushed crimson. "Objection, Your Honor! Mr. Bell is resorting to speculation and character assassination." Judge Thompson raised a silencing hand. Mr. Bell, proceed with caution. Confine yourself to the facts. But Marcus detected a spark in the judge's eyes, a suggestion of curiosity that he seized upon. The facts, Your Honor, are these: a coerced confession, questionable forensic findings, and untrustworthy eyewitness identification. The prosecution's case is a precarious edifice, built on shifting sands. He turned back to the jury. They are asking you to convict an innocent woman based on flimsy proof and a blatant disregard for due process. He directed his attention back to the judge. Your Honor, I wish to present new evidence. I have here a sworn statement from a neighbor of the victim, Mrs. Eleanor Davies, claiming to have witnessed a man matching a dissimilar description fleeing the scene that night. This man was considerably taller and heavier than Ms. Carter, and Mrs. Davies distinctly recalls him wearing a dark blue jacket, an article of clothing never recovered by law enforcement. Jenkins's face hardened into a mask of fury. Where did you obtain this affidavit? This is outrageous. This witness was never disclosed. That's because the police never bothered to interview her, Marcus rejoined, his voice laced with barely concealed contempt. Too preoccupied with focusing on their prime suspect, a convenient patsy, perhaps? A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom gallery. Heads swiveled, hushed conversations erupted. The atmosphere in the room had undergone a transformation. What had begun as a predetermined outcome now resembled a legitimate dispute. Judge Thompson struck his gavel, restoring quiet. Ms. Jenkins, address Mr. Bell's contentions. And Mr. Bell, please submit the affidavit to the court. Marcus walked to the bench and handed the affidavit to the clerk, his eyes meeting Judge Thompson's. For the first time, he perceived a glimmer of something besides detached indifference in the judge's countenance. Was it skepticism? Or something altogether different? Jenkins, obviously disconcerted, began to stammer. Your Honor, this affidavit is unsubstantiated. It's inadmissible. Such testimony is admissible when it generates reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case. Marcus countered, citing another obscure legal passage, buried deep within the evidence code. And Mrs. Davies' testimony, coupled with the other inconsistencies I've highlighted, generates a substantial degree of reasonable doubt. Sufficient, I submit, to warrant a dismissal of the accusations. He watched as Judge Thompson reclined in his chair, his face a picture of intense concentration. The courtroom held its collective breath, every gaze riveted on the judge. The air vibrated with anticipation. Finally, Judge Thompson spoke, his tone deliberate and measured. Ms. Jenkins, I find Mr. Bell's arguments persuasive. The prosecution's case, as it stands, appears predicated on circumstantial details and a confession that may have been obtained under dubious circumstances. I am particularly troubled by the disparities in the forensic evidence and the previously undisclosed eyewitness testimony. Jenkins opened her mouth to protest, but Judge Thompson cut her off. I am not dismissing the case, Ms. Jenkins. Not at this time. But I am directing the prosecution to conduct a thorough reinvestigation, taking into consideration the new evidence presented by Mr. Bell. I expect a comprehensive report within 14 days. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Bell, I commend you for your diligence and your tenacity. However, I must remind you that you remain subject to the contempt of court charges from our earlier encounter. Those will be addressed at a later date. He struck his gavel again. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus felt a wave of exhaustion engulf him. He had bought Emily a reprieve, but the war was far from one. He had punctured holes in the prosecution's narrative, but he hadn't scuttled it. He knew Jenkins would return with heightened resolve, more determined than ever to prevail. Evelyn Reed approached him, her eyes gleaming with admiration. That was phenomenal, Marcus. You were incredible. He managed a weary smile. Thanks, Evelyn. I couldn't have achieved it without your support. Don't diminish your accomplishment, she said, bumping his shoulder. You possess the fortitude to wield it. As he exited the courthouse, the setting sun casting elongated shadows, Marcus experienced a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer merely a disgraced attorney, attempting to salvage his reputation. He was a champion for the voiceless, a warrior for equity. And he wouldn't rest until Emily Carter was exonerated. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Thompson sat transfixed, staring at the closed portal. The courtroom's echoes reverberated in his mind, the arguments swirling within him. He felt the disquiet he hadn't known in years, a relentless suspicion that something was fundamentally awry. He picked up the file on the Emily Carter case, the one he presumed closed long ago. He flipped through the pages, his eyes dissecting the evidence, the statements, the judgments. He saw his own signature on the final ruling, a testament to his conviction. But now, the conviction had dissolved, supplanted by a gnawing uncertainty. Had he erred? Had he condemned an innocent woman? He slammed the file shut, the sound shattering the silent chamber. He could no longer ignore this sensation. He needed to ascertain the truth, even if it meant confronting his own history, even if it meant admitting his fallibility. He reached for the telephone, his hand trembling slightly. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a number belonging to a former detective, a retired member of the force. "John," he said, his voice subdued and urgent. "I require your assistance. I need you to investigate a case for me. The Emily Carter case." He paused, inhaling deeply. I suspect I might have made a mistake." Fading amusement. The smirk that had been Judge Thompson's companion that morning began to fray. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a subtle unraveling, like a cheap hem giving way. He'd anticipated a farce, a pathetic legal scramble from Bell, a man already branded a felon. Instead, he was witnessing a surgical takedown, a chillingly precise dissection of the prosecution's carefully built case. Marcus Bell, still clad in the demeaning prison garb, stood defiant. Though a profound weariness colored his voice, it cut through the courtroom with unexpected precision. He deflected ADA Jenkins's objections with uncanny ease, wielding legal citations like a seasoned gladiator brandishing a sword. The initial gleam of condescension in Thompson's eyes now sputtered like a faulty light bulb. Jenkins, usually a paragon of controlled power, visibly wilted. Her impeccable suit now seemed a size too large, her rehearsed pronouncements echoing with hollowness as Bell relentlessly chipped away at the prosecution's edifice. Objections tumbled from her lips, her voice climbing an octave, each met by Bell's calm, almost sympathetic stare. Thompson observed her frantic rifling through notes, the initial confidence replaced by a tangible anxiety he could almost taste. How could he possess such knowledge? Thompson's internal query felt discordant against the backdrop of his carefully curated composure. He'd overseen countless trials, witnessed legions of lawyers plead their cases, yet something about Bell felt fundamentally different. It was more than rote legal knowledge, it was an intrinsic, bone-deep understanding of justice. An understanding that Thompson, perched comfortably on his judicial throne, had perhaps grown detached from. Bell was currently dismantling the testimony of a key witness, the supposed eyewitness who placed Emily Carter at the crime scene. With a series of artfully crafted questions, he exposed gaping holes in the account, drawing attention to the dim lighting and the witness's admitted history of visual impairment. Then came the knockout punch, a signed affidavit from a reluctant individual claiming the eyewitness had been pressured by detectives eager for a conviction. Jenkins shot to her feet, a crimson tide rising in her cheeks. "Objection, Your Honor! Hearsay! This is a blatant attempt to introduce inadmissible evidence." "Overruled," Thompson declared, his voice surprisingly resonant. He caught the flicker of shock on Jenkins's face, but pressed on. "Mr. Bell has laid sufficient groundwork to challenge the witness's reliability. The affidavit stands." He watched Bell proceed, his voice unwavering, his focus laser-like. The courtroom, typically a murmurous hive, fell silent, every gaze riveted on the improbable figure in the ill-fitting uniform. Thompson felt the collective weight of their attention, the unspoken questions swirling in the air. Was this truly justice? Had an innocent woman been unjustly accused? Had he, in some way, contributed to that travesty? The judicial robes suddenly felt leaden, the gavel in his hand a symbol of authority he questioned whether he still deserved. As Bell concluded, summarizing the prosecution's frailties with crystalline clarity, Thompson felt a profound disquiet take root. It wasn't merely the possibility of Emily Carter's innocence. It was the stark realization that he'd nearly allowed her conviction based on what now appeared to be flimsy, circumstantial threads. He'd been so quick to dismiss Bell as a mere rabble-rouser, a disruptive element in his orderly court, that he nearly overlooked the truth glaring back at him. A defeated yet defiant, Jenkins approached the bench. "Your Honor, I request a recess. I require time to re-evaluate the evidence and prepare a rebuttal." Thompson granted her request, adjourning the hearing until the following day. As he stood, he avoided Bell's gaze, unable to confront the silent condemnation he imagined reflected there. Back in chambers, Thompson paced restlessly. The comforting accoutrements of his office, the leather-bound volumes, the gleaming mahogany desk, the solemn portraits of legal luminaries, offered no solace. He felt adrift, severed from the certainty that had always been his compass. He mentally replayed the day's proceedings, dissecting each argument, each objection, each subtle inflection in Bell's presentation. He had to concede, begrudgingly, that the man possessed a legal acumen rivaling some of the finest barristers he'd encountered. His raw talent was undeniable, his grasp of precedent astonishing. And yet, he was a convicted criminal, an escapee from the very justice system Thompson represented. How was this possible? He retrieved the file from Marcus Bell's original case, the one that had landed him in prison. He had presided over that trial as well, years prior. He recalled Bell as an arrogant, defiant youth, representing himself, convinced of his own rectitude. He had summarily dismissed Bell's accusations of police misconduct and prosecutorial excess, swayed by the seemingly conclusive evidence presented by the prosecution. Now, confronted with the sterile facts of the case, he couldn't suppress the nagging feeling that he had been too hasty in his judgment. He scrutinized the transcripts, zeroing in on details he had previously dismissed. He noticed the inconsistencies in the witness statements, the tenuousness of the evidence. He also recognized the dismissive tone of his own pronouncements, his impatience with Bell's self-defense. Had he been biased? Had his preconceived notions clouded his discernment? The thought stung, a direct assault on his carefully cultivated image of impartiality. He had always taken pride in his ability to discern truth from deception, to weigh evidence objectively, to deliver justice without fear or favor. But now, he was forced to grapple with the possibility of his own failure, of having condemned an innocent man. He knew what action he must now take. He needed to investigate. He had to excavate the truth of the Emily Carter case, regardless of where it led. He could no longer rely solely on the prosecution or the defense. He had to launch his own independent inquiry. His hand trembling slightly, he reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, that of a retired detective, a man he trusted implicitly, a man known for his unwavering honesty and integrity. "Frank," he said, his tone low and grave, "I need your assistance. There is a case that I'd like you to examine, a case that may have gone horribly wrong." Meanwhile, in a cramped holding cell beneath the courthouse, Marcus Bell slumped on a cold metal bench, his head buried in his hands. The adrenaline that had fueled his courtroom performance had evaporated, leaving him depleted. He had exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's argument, he had sown seeds of doubt in the judge's mind, but he understood that the battle was far from over. Jenkins would return, armed with fresh evidence, revitalized arguments, and novel strategies. She would not surrender easily. She had too much riding on this case, too much at stake. He closed his eyes, attempting to block out the din of the jail, the metallic clang of doors, the cries of his fellow inmates. He pictured Emily's face, pale, etched with worry, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had promised to secure her release, he had vowed to clear her name. Failure was not an option. Yet doubt gnawed at him, a persistent whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Was he up to this challenge? Was he intelligent enough? Could he surmount the formidable forces arrayed against him? His gaze sharpened as he opened his eyes. He had no alternative. He must persist, for Emily, for himself, for the possibility of finally achieving justice. Ada Jenkins slammed her office door, causing her assistant to jump in alarm. She charged to her desk, depositing her briefcase with a resounding thud. That prisoner, she sputtered, her face flushing crimson. Does he really think he can stroll in here and topple my case? Does he actually believe he can outmaneuver me? Lisa, her young assistant, carefully approached the desk. He did raise some interesting points, Ms. Jenkins, she ventured cautiously. Interesting points? Jenkins erupted. That was nothing more than a smokescreen, an underhanded tactic to muddy the waters. He's a convicted criminal, Lisa. He has absolutely no justification to question my work or the legitimacy of this office. She paced the length of her office, her irritation growing with each stride. She had dedicated months to crafting this meticulously detailed case against Emily Carter, painstakingly gathering evidence, carefully constructing her narrative. Now, all of that was jeopardized by the impudent actions of an escaped convict. She had underestimated him. She had dismissed him as a run-of-the-mill criminal, a legal ignoramus. But he had proven to be anything but. He was quick-witted, possessed a sharp understanding of legal principles, and displayed a relentless determination that verged on obsession. She couldn't allow him to prevail. She wouldn't permit him to prevail. She had to devise a strategy to regain control of the case, to undermine his arguments, to silence him permanently. She halted her pacing and turned to Lisa, her eyes narrowing. I want you to locate every file, every document, every scrap of evidence relating to Marcus Bell's initial case, she commanded, her voice low and menacing. I want to know everything about him, every error he's ever committed, every vulnerability he possesses. I need to discover something, anything, that I can use against him. He wants to engage in a dirty fight? So be it. I can play dirty too. The amusement that had initially veiled Judge Thompson's perception of Marcus Bell had not only evaporated, but had been supplanted by a profound disquiet, a premonition that settled deep in his gut. The ensuing days promised not a mere legal contest, but a confrontation with his own history and the unsettling realities underlying the system he represented. The overlooked evidence. The fluorescent tubes in the lockup buzzed an irritating counterpoint to the turmoil churning within Marcus. Instead of sleep, he'd been dissecting the prosecution's case, hunting for weakness. Finally, he'd unearthed it. Leaning against the cold wall, its rough texture a physical manifestation of his unease, he felt the familiar clatter of the guard's keys. Lion's Den awaits, Bell, the guard rasped, swinging the door open. Marcus nodded, the courthouse's stale air almost refreshing after the cell's oppressive confinement. He pictured Emily's hopeful, yet apprehensive face from the previous day. He wouldn't fail her. Back in court, the air crackled with anticipation. Judge Thompson, unreadable as ever, occupied the bench. He'd been unusually taciturn this morning. Across the room, Ada Jenkins fairly vibrated with tightly leashed rage, her gaze a laser tracking Marcus as he approached the defense table. Mr. Bell, Judge Thompson initiated, his tone impartial. You may continue. Marcus straightened, drawing on reserves of inner fortitude. Your Honor, he began, his voice resonant and clear. Yesterday, the prosecution presented what appeared to be an airtight case, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness accounts. They portrayed Emily Carter as a woman driven to desperation. He paused for effect. That portrait, however, is fundamentally flawed. It purposefully excludes vital elements that reshape the entire picture. A scoff escaped Jenkins, briefly fracturing her rigid composure. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making unsubstantiated allegations. Overruled for now, Judge Thompson stated, his focus unwavering. But I expect immediate substantiation, Mr. Bell. You'll have it, Your Honor. Marcus addressed the jury, meeting their gazes squarely. The prosecution emphasized Ms. Carter's financial troubles, suggesting a motive for murder. What they neglected to mention were a series of significant transactions that took place in the weeks before Mr. Harrison's demise. He produced a stack of meticulously organized documents from his briefcase. These are subpoenaed bank statements from Mr. Harrison's business account. They reveal a series of substantial cash withdrawals, exceeding $50,000, made in small increments over a fortnight. A ripple of murmurs washed over the courtroom. Jenkins' face lost color. These withdrawals, Marcus continued, deviated sharply from Mr. Harrison's established business practices. He consistently favored electronic transfers, as years of records confirm. What, then, prompted this sudden need for large sums in cash? He turned towards Jenkins, his voice edged with restrained accusation. Did the prosecution investigate the destination of this money, Ms. Jenkins? Did they attempt to trace its trajectory? Jenkins sputtered. Objection! Counsel is attempting to badger me, Your Honor. Sustained. Judge Thompson ruled, a hint of curiosity coloring his tone. Mr. Bell, confine your remarks to the evidence. Of course, Your Honor. Marcus re-engaged the jury. The prosecution chose to disregard these transactions, to present a skewed rendition of the facts. However, I have ascertained the destination of at least some of that money. He displayed an enlarged image of a check, made out to a shell corporation based in the Bahamas. This check, amounting to $20,000, was deposited into an account controlled by an associate of organized crime. An individual, I might add, with a documented history of threatening Mr. Harrison over a failed venture. The courtroom erupted in hushed chaos. The jurors leaned forward, riveted to the check. Even Judge Thompson's customary impassivity wavered. Jenkins shot to her feet, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. This is an outrage. This evidence was never disclosed. Where did you obtain this? Marcus met her fury head-on. The source, Ms. Jenkins, is immaterial. What matters is its existence, and its profound impact on your case. It points to a far more intricate scenario than a simple lover's quarrel. It suggests that others possessed a more compelling motive and greater means to silence Mr. Harrison. He moved toward Emily, who watched with wide, hopeful eyes. It suggests, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that you are being asked to convict an innocent woman based on a purposefully incomplete and distorted presentation of the truth. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Every eye in the courtroom was drawn to Marcus, to Emily, to the incriminating check. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, shattering the stillness. Ms. Jenkins, he said, his voice unusually sharp. Do you have an explanation for this oversight? Visibly rattled, Jenkins stammered. Your Honor, we were unaware of this evidence. Our focus was on the evidence directly implicating Ms. Carter. Focused on the evidence that validated your narrative. Marcus interjected, his voice a low, sharp blade. Judge Thompson shot him a warning glance. Mr. Bell, while I understand your fervor, I must insist upon decorum. He turned back to Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, I expect a comprehensive explanation for this omission, and I expect it forthwith. Jenkins nodded, her face a study in barely controlled anger. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Thompson addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we will recess until tomorrow morning. I urge you to refrain from discussing this new evidence amongst yourselves. We will reconvene at that time. As the jurors streamed out, buzzing with speculation, a wave of exhaustion washed over Marcus. He struck a powerful blow. But Jenkins wouldn't concede defeat easily. She'd retaliate, stronger than before. As the bailiff led Emily away, she turned to Marcus, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you for believing me. He gave her a weary smile. Just revealing the truth, Emily. That's all. Back in the lockup, the fluorescent lights seemed more glaring, the silence more intense. He had to stay one jump ahead of Jenkins, anticipate her next play. He shut his eyes, attempting to shut out the noise, the strain, the immense weight of responsibility. He needed to rest, to gird himself for what lay ahead. But sleep evaded him. His mind churned, reviewing the day's events, searching for any overlooked detail, any vulnerability in his defense. He knew Jenkins would be working tirelessly to undermine him, to unearth anything she could exploit to damage his credibility. He thought of his past, the events that had landed him in prison to begin with, the false conviction that had robbed him of years. He'd vowed to dedicate his life to helping others, to championing justice wherever it was denied. Yet, his history made him susceptible, a prime target for those aiming to silence him. His eyes snapped open, his gaze hardening. He wouldn't let them win. He wouldn't let them destroy him. He would fight for Emily, and he would fight for his own redemption. He would expose the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The guard's keys jangled, interrupting his thoughts. "You have a visitor, Belle," he announced, unlocking the door. Marcus frowned, surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone. He exited the cell and followed the guard down the corridor. As he entered the visiting room, he was stunned to find Judge Thompson seated at one of the tables, his face grim. Marcus halted, taken aback. "Your Honor," he said, uncertain what to make of this unexpected encounter. "Is something amiss?" Judge Thompson gestured towards a chair. "I wish to speak with you privately, Mr. Bell," he stated, his voice subdued. "Regarding the evidence you presented today." Marcus sat, his senses heightened. He sensed this conversation could alter everything. He just didn't know how. "Tell me, Mr. Bell," Judge Thompson began, his gaze intense. "Where did you acquire that check?" Silence in the gallery. A stillness settled over the courtroom, heavier than the usual respect afforded Judge Thompson. This was a palpable hush, a blanket of disbelief that seemed to cling to the very walls, deadening the hum of the fluorescent lights. The gallery's nervous energy, previously a waspish drone of speculation, ebbed away in stages. As the implications of Marcus's bombshell, the buried evidence, the questionable funds, the victim's ties to the underworld, took root, the murmurs evaporated, leaving behind a thick, almost chewable quiet. In the adjacent holding cell, Marcus couldn't see the change, but he felt its subtle shift. The atmosphere vibrated on a different frequency, the customary courthouse noises softened, replaced by a low, expectant pulse. He sat on the unforgiving metal bench, the orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of his past transgressions, and wrestled with his breathing. The interview with Thompson had left him raw. The judge's pointed questions, the veiled menace, had resurrected a familiar blend of dread and defiance. He walked a precarious line, teetering on the precipice of exposure, yet retreat was unthinkable. Not with Emily's life hanging by a thread. The courtroom camera swept across the gallery. Mrs. Henderson, Emily's mother, sat ramrod straight, her gaze a precarious mix of hope and fear. Her knuckles shone ivory as she clutched the hand of her companion, a steadfast pillar of support throughout the ordeal. Their expressions mirrored the pervasive unease. They had endured so many disappointments, so many legal contortions seemingly designed to thwart Emily's cause, that a full embrace of this potential turning point felt dangerously premature. Across the aisle, the victim's family remained rigidly silent. The grief and righteous indignation that had defined their faces now yielded to expressions of confusion. Their unwavering certainty, so evident throughout the trial, had begun to fissure, replaced by a glimmer of doubt. The revelation of the victim's shady dealings had upended their narrative, casting a long, unsettling pall over their quest for justice. The press corps, typically scribbling with furious abandon, had paused, their pens hovering above their notepads. Their initial skepticism towards Marcus's defense had given way to an acute professional interest. This was no longer a straightforward case. This was a story ripe with potential scandal, and they were poised to document every convolution. Judge Thompson, his face an impassive mask, scanned the room. He felt the pressure of the silence, the unspoken questions swirling around him like a gathering vortex. He had meticulously cultivated an image of impeccable impartiality, a reputation for unwavering adherence to the law. Now, that image was under siege, not only by Marcus's explosive revelation but by the disquieting realization that he, himself, might have been, however unwittingly, an accessory to a profound injustice. He cleared his throat, the sound magnified by the stillness. "Order," he managed, his voice barely audible. "I will maintain order in my courtroom." His words proved futile. The gallery remained a study in hushed anticipation, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric, or a suppressed cough straining to cut through the tension. He slammed his gavel, the sharp report reverberating through the chamber. "I said order." This time, his voice held more command, but a tremor of anxiety still edged its tone. Slowly, reluctantly, the gallery began to shift. Heads turned, eyes darted, and a low susurrus of whispers began to swell, like a receding tide creeping back in. But this was a different cadence, not the dismissive, judgmental drone of before, but a hushed, inquisitive undertone laced with conjecture and uncertainty. "Did you hear that?" a woman in the back row breathed to her neighbor. "The victim had ties to organized crime? I refuse to believe it." The other woman countered, her voice barely a breath. "There has to be some mistake." "But what if there isn't?" the first woman pressed, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "What if they convicted the wrong man?" The whispers spread like a contagion, igniting sparks of uncertainty in the minds of all present. Even the court officers, typically stoic and inscrutable, exchanged worried glances. They had witnessed countless trials, absorbed countless arguments, but this felt different. This felt wrong. Judge Thompson observed the burgeoning chaos with escalating frustration. Control of his courtroom had slipped from his grasp, and he knew it. Regaining that control was paramount, not just to restore order, but to buy himself time to analyze, to evaluate the situation, to determine his next move. "Mr. Peterson," he said, turning to the assistant district attorney, his voice edged with steel. "I demand an explanation. Now. Enlighten the court as to why this information, this alleged payment, was withheld from the defense." Peterson, who had been sitting ramrod straight at the prosecution table, his face ashen, rose slowly. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. His gaze darted from Thompson to the jury to the gallery, like a cornered animal. The self-assured swagger he had projected throughout the trial had evaporated, replaced by stark terror. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice a mere thread. I was unaware of this payment. I assure you, I had no knowledge." "That is insufficient, Mr. Peterson," Thompson cut in, his voice like honed steel. "This is a grave matter. Evidence was suppressed. A defendant's life hangs in the balance. I expect a complete and truthful explanation, and I expect it forthwith." Peterson swallowed convulsively, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He understood the depth of his predicament. He had been so consumed with securing a conviction, with bolstering his reputation, that ambition had blinded him. He had disregarded the warning signs, overlooked the inconsistencies, and now he faced the consequences. "Your Honor," he repeated, his voice marginally stronger, "I will launch a comprehensive investigation. I will trace the source of this information and determine why it was suppressed. I pledge to uncover the truth." Thompson held his gaze, his eyes like chips of ice. He discounted Peterson's excuses entirely. He suspected the ADA knew far more than he admitted, but he lacked proof. "Not yet." "Very well, Mr. Peterson," he said finally, his voice dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. "I expect that investigation to proceed with utmost alacrity. In the interim, I am adjourning this court until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. He slammed his gavel again, the sound echoing through the chamber, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. The gallery began to empty slowly, the whispers persisting, the questions lingering in the air like a miasma. As the courtroom emptied, Thompson remained seated on the bench, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Marcus Bell had stood mere hours before. He couldn't shake the conviction that he was being manipulated, that he was a mere pawn in a much larger, more intricate game. And he couldn't dispel the nagging suspicion that he had committed a grievous error, an error pregnant with potentially devastating consequences. He rose stiffly, his joints protesting with familiar aches. He needed to escape the confines of the courtroom, to clear his mind, to strategize. He exited through the back door of the courtroom, proceeding down the long, deserted hallway to his chambers. As he walked, he reached a decision. He would personally investigate the Emily Carter case. He would unearth the truth, irrespective of where it led. Back in the holding cell, Marcus heard the heavy door clang shut, signifying the conclusion of the day's session. He rose, stretched his aching limbs, and walked to the small, barred window. He gazed out at the leaden sky, the towering buildings of the city, and a surge of hope coursed through him. He had planted a seed of doubt, a kernel of truth, and he knew it would sprout. He was one step closer to liberating Emily Carter, and one step closer to claiming his own redemption. But he was also aware that he had made formidable adversaries, enemies who would stop at nothing to silence him. The game was far from settled. In truth, it was only beginning. The gallery's silence had been shattered, but the true battle was about to commence. Control and chaos. The judge's gavel crashed down, the reverberation a stark exclamation point in the hushed courtroom. "Mr. Bell! This charade ends now. You will confine your remarks to the relevant facts." He adjusted his spectacles, the set of his jaw betraying a struggle to maintain composure. The revelation of Emily Carter's ties to underworld figures and the intimation that vital evidence was suppressed by the prosecution had rattled him profoundly. From the defense table, Marcus, though confined by an orange jumpsuit and guarded by two stone-faced officers, held his ground. His voice, while even, resonated with unyielding resolve. "With respect, Your Honor, the prosecution's facts are a carefully sculpted fiction masking the truth. The evidence I offer directly challenges their depiction of Emily Carter as a remorseless killer, revealing a compelling motive for others to have perpetrated this crime. Suppressing this information would be a profound betrayal of justice." Thompson leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You flirt with contempt, Mr. Bell. I've granted you considerable latitude, given the unorthodox nature of your representation. But I refuse to permit the transformation of this courtroom into a stage for unsubstantiated claims and conspiratorial fantasies." Marcus inhaled deeply, deliberately. He was acutely aware of the precariousness of his position, yet Emily's liberty, perhaps his own, hinged on his ability to navigate this treacherous legal terrain. "Your Honor," he began, his tone precise, "I present not baseless accusations, but suppressed evidence, deliberately withheld from the defense. The prosecution bore a responsibility to disclose this information, and their failure constitutes a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Even seasoned observers recognized the gravity of that legal precedent. Brady v. Maryland enshrined the prosecution's duty to furnish exculpatory material to the defense, potential evidence of innocence. To deliberately conceal such material was a grave ethical and legal transgression. The judge's grip on the gavel tightened, knuckles bone-white. He knew Marcus's citation was legally sound, in theory. But acknowledging prosecutorial suppression held massive implications. It would unlock the door to a mistrial, potentially collapsing the case and staining his own record. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice strained, "your interpretation of Brady is inventive, at best. The prosecution asserts that the evidence in question lacked materiality and therefore did not require disclosure. Materiality, Your Honor, is a determination for the court, not the prosecution," Marcus parried, his eyes locked on the judge. "And I contend that evidence linking the deceased to organized crime, suggesting involvement in illicit activities that could have made him a target, is undeniably material to establishing motive." The air crackled with tension. Judge Thompson, a man who saw himself as a bastion of legal rectitude, found himself cornered. He could silence Marcus, burying the inconvenient truth, but risk appearing complicit in a potential cover-up. Or, he could allow Marcus to continue, risking the unraveling of the case and the exposure of his own earlier oversights. He shifted, a rivulet of perspiration tracing a path down his temple. "The court will stand in recess," he announced, a tremor audible in his voice. "Mr. Bell, remain in custody." As the guard steered Marcus away, a spark of hope flickered within him. He had sown a seed of doubt, taking root in the judge's mind. Despite initial opposition, Thompson was clearly disturbed by the implications. He felt the weight of the judge's scrutiny as he was led from the room. Back in the holding cell, the chill of the steel bars felt less menacing. He remained in a vulnerable position, facing powerful adversaries, but he had disrupted the meticulously crafted narrative, revealing the fissures in the facade of justice. He closed his eyes, conjuring Emily's face, drawing sustenance from the hope fueling his fight for her freedom. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Thompson was a caged animal, pacing furiously. He poured a glass of water, his hand betraying a slight tremor as he brought it to his lips. Marcus Bell's words echoed in his mind, accusatory and unsettling. He battled the sensation that something reeked, that the case he had overseen for so long rested upon a foundation of falsehoods and omissions. He sank heavily into his leather chair, the burden of his responsibilities a palpable weight. He had always placed unwavering faith in the integrity of the justice system, in its capability to deliver impartial verdicts. But now, he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been hoodwinked, that he had allowed himself to be manipulated by ambitious prosecutors and biased investigators. He opened the case file, the daunting stack of papers a silent monument to the years he had poured into this case. He began to reread slowly, methodically, this time with critical scrutiny, searching for the inconsistencies and gaps Marcus had highlighted. The deeper he delved, the more disquieted he felt. The evidence presented by Marcus, evidence that should have been readily available to the defense, was conspicuously absent from the file. He snatched the phone and punched in the number for the lead prosecutor, David Harding. Harding was a rising star in the DA's office, renowned for his razor-sharp intellect and his dogged pursuit of convictions. But Thompson had always sensed a vein of ruthlessness beneath the polished veneer, a willingness to cut corners to secure his objectives. Harding answered quickly. "Judge Thompson, what an unexpected pleasure." "I need to see you, David," Thompson said, his voice clipped. "Immediately. Come to my chambers." Harding paused momentarily. "Is there a problem, Your Honor?" "Just come," Thompson said, then slammed the phone down. He knew that confronting Harding was fraught with risk. Harding wielded significant power, with connections extending to the highest echelons of the legal system. But Thompson could no longer ignore the nagging conviction that he had abetted a miscarriage of justice. He had a duty to unearth the truth, regardless of the personal cost. Within minutes, Harding arrived at his chambers, his face a study in professional concern. "Judge, you seem troubled. What's happened?" Thompson gestured towards a chair. "I've been revisiting the Carter case, David," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "And I have questions about the evidence." Harding leaned back, his expression guarded. "What kind of questions, Your Honor?" "Specifically," Thompson said, "I'm concerned about the evidence Mr. Bell presented today, linking the victim to organized crime. Why wasn't this information disclosed to the defense?" Harding's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "That evidence was deemed irrelevant, Your Honor. It bore no weight on Emily Carter's guilt or innocence." "Irrelevant?" Thompson arched an eyebrow. "A connection to organized crime, a potential motive for others to commit the murder, is irrelevant? I find that difficult to accept, David." Harding shifted uneasily. "We investigated those leads, Your Honor, and they proved fruitless. We didn't want to muddy the waters with conjecture and speculation." "And who made the call to withhold this information?" Thompson pressed. Harding hesitated, then replied, "I did, Your Honor. I accept full responsibility." Thompson stared at him, his face etched with disapproval. "You understand that withholding exculpatory evidence is a violation of Brady, David? It could jeopardize the entire case." Harding shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "I acted in the best interests of justice, Your Honor. I believe that Emily Carter is guilty, and I didn't want anything to sway the jury from the truth." "The truth?" Thompson's voice rose a fraction. "Or your version of the truth? You deliberately suppressed evidence that could have exonerated her, evidence that could have spared an innocent woman years in prison. How do you justify that, David?" Harding rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "I don't need to justify my actions to you, Judge. I did what was necessary to protect the community from a dangerous criminal." "And what about protecting the integrity of the justice system?" Thompson countered sharply. "What about upholding the tenets of fairness and impartiality? You've betrayed those principles, David. You've eroded the very bedrock of our legal framework." Harding turned to leave, his face a mask of defiance. "I have nothing further to say, Your Honor." "This isn't over, David," Thompson said, his voice like ice. "I intend to unearth the truth, no matter the path it takes." As Harding stormed from his chambers, Thompson felt the crushing weight of exhaustion. He had opened Pandora's box, and he knew the consequences would be far-reaching. But retreat was no longer an option. He had a duty to expose the decay that had festered within the justice system for too long. He felt the weight of his position, but with it, a spark of resolve. He would not let this case be buried. Justice, he saw, demanded something deeper than mere legal procedure. It demanded unwavering truth. The surprise witness. The courtroom stilled as Marcus stood, every eye fixed on him. A pregnant silence descended, amplifying the significance of his next words. He locked eyes with Judge Thompson. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice unwavering despite the inner storm. "The defense calls Maria Rodriguez to testify." Jenkins visibly recoiled, surprise contorting her features. This was a curveball, absent from the agreed disclosures. Unprepared, she fumbled for order in her notes, a crimson tide rising on her cheeks. A wave of whispers cascaded through the gallery. "Maria Rodriguez?" The name drew blank stares. Beside Marcus, Emily's hand tightened around his, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Maria Rodriguez," the bailiff's voice echoed. A slight woman, radiating reluctance, shuffled toward the stand. She seemed to yearn for any other place on earth. Her gaze skittered around the room, momentarily snagging on Marcus before darting away. Dressed in unassuming attire, a severe bun anchoring her dark hair, her very posture telegraphed anxiety. The oath, when she spoke it, caught in her throat, a mere tremor of sound. Marcus approached, his pace deliberate, projecting an assurance he didn't fully feel. He knew he had to handle Maria with kid gloves. "Ms. Rodriguez," he began softly. "For the record, could you state your name and address?" "Maria Rodriguez," she repeated, barely audible. 212 Elm Street. "Ms. Rodriguez, do you recognize the defendant, Emily Carter?" Hesitation flickered across her face, her eyes flitting between Emily and Marcus. "Yes," she breathed. I know her." "And in what capacity do you know her?" She inhaled deeply, her hands twisting in her lap like restless birds. I used to be employed alongside her at the gallery." Marcus offered an encouraging nod. "The gallery that was subject to a robbery on the night of October 14th? "Yes," she affirmed, her voice a mere thread. Jenkins surged to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor!" Leading. Judge Thompson sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Sustained." "Mr. Bell, rephrase the question." Marcus refocused on Maria, offering a reassuring smile. "Ms. Rodriguez, in your own words, can you describe your knowledge of the events that transpired that night?" Tears glistened in her eyes. She squeezed them shut, momentarily seeking composure. I witnessed something that night," she stammered. "Something I should have disclosed to law enforcement, but I was paralyzed by fear." "Fear of what, Ms. Rodriguez?" Marcus gently probed. "Fear of potential repercussions," she breathed. "For my family." "Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus stated, his tone firm yet empathetic. "You're under oath, shielded by this court. Truth is the only currency recognized here. No harm can befall you for its utterance." He connected with her gaze, imbuing his words with sincerity. A spark of hope ignited in her eyes. "Okay," she conceded, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Okay, I'll tell you." A pause, as she gathered her scattered thoughts, then the words tumbled forth in a torrent. "That night, October 14th, I was putting in extra time, finalizing paperwork in the back office. Everyone else had departed. I overheard sounds, deafening sounds, emanating from the main gallery. Like items being shattered. "Did you observe anyone, Ms. Rodriguez?" Marcus inquired. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice wavering once more. I saw a pair of men. They concealed their faces with masks. They were absconding with canvases. Bulky canvases. "And did you identify either of these men?" Maria wavered, her eyes flitting towards a glowering Jenkins. "No," she whispered. "I couldn't discern their identities." Are you entirely certain, Ms. Rodriguez? Marcus persisted, his tone gentle yet unwavering. She closed her eyes momentarily, then reopened them, fixing her gaze on Marcus. No, she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. I couldn't place their faces, but I recognized the timbre of one. The courtroom suffocated and held breath. Whose voice did you recognize, Ms. Rodriguez? Marcus's voice barely broke the silence. Maria gulped air. I recognized Detective Miller's vocal signature. A unified gasp swept the room. Jenkins shot up, her face twisting with outrage. Objection! Your Honor, this is scandalous. A transparent attempt to malign a respected officer of the law. There's absolutely no foundation for this accusation. Judge Thompson raised a silencing hand. Ms. Jenkins, your concern is understood. However, the witness is under oath and possesses the right to testify. The jury will be instructed to weigh her testimony judiciously, but she won't be prevented from speaking. He addressed Maria. Ms. Rodriguez, are you positive about this assertion? Maria nodded, tears brimming. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. I'm certain. That particular voice is etched in my memory. I've heard it too many times. It belonged to Detective Miller. Marcus retreated, allowing the weight of Maria's revelation to permeate the atmosphere. The silence was a tangible thing. He glanced at Emily, whose face reflected a bewildered hope. Jenkins, her face flushed, began her cross-examination, each word laced with venom. Ms. Rodriguez, she began. You maintain that you placed Detective Miller's voice? Is that your testimony? Yes, Maria confirmed, her voice barely registering. And what is the depth of your familiarity with Detective Miller's voice? Maria hesitated. I've overheard him speak on occasion. She stumbled. At the precinct. When I initially reported the incident. So you're requesting that this court believe that, based on fleeting encounters, you can definitively identify Detective Miller, even through a disguise? Maria's gaze darted, her anxiety palpable. I know his vocal patterns, she insisted. I'm steadfast in that assessment. Is it not plausible that you erred, Ms. Rodriguez? Jenkins pressed, her tone sharp and accusatory. That you misconstrued the sound or that your recollection is failing you? No, Maria replied, her voice firmer. I'm not mistaken. I'm confident in my statement. Jenkins moved in. Ms. Rodriguez, have you ever sought treatment for any psychological vulnerabilities? Objection, Marcus barked. Your Honor, this is irrelevant and prejudicial maneuvering. Judge Thompson sustained. Ms. Jenkins, that line of inquiry is unsuitable. Jenkins disregarded the censure. Ms. Rodriguez, is it not a matter of record that you have a history of making, shall we characterize them as, unreliable pronouncements? Objection, Marcus repeated, his voice rising in volume. Your Honor, this is harassment bordering on intimidation. Judge Thompson fixed a glare on Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, this is a formal warning. Another improper question will result in a contempt of court citation. Jenkins, momentarily silenced, regrouped and shifted her attack, focusing on Maria's late arrival. Ms. Rodriguez, you assert that you witnessed this felony on October 14th. Why are you only stepping forward now, months after the fact? Tears welled again in Maria's eyes. I was frightened, she whispered. I dreaded potential ramifications for my loved ones. Detective Miller, he holds considerable power. I wish to remain uninvolved. So, you knowingly permitted an innocent woman to be wrongly accused of a crime, subjected to trial due to fear? Jenkins relentlessly pressed. Maria hung her head, her shoulders convulsing. I am aware that it was ethically wrong, she confessed. I should have reported it sooner. The magnitude of fear froze me. Jenkins paused, letting Maria's distress settle. Then, she dropped her calculated bomb. Ms. Rodriguez, isn't it accurate that you've been tendered a significant financial inducement to proffer this testimony? Marcus exploded to his feet. Objection! Your Honor, There's absolutely no verifiable evidence to substantiate that spurious assertion. Merely posing a question to the witness, Your Honor. Jenkins drawled, malice dripping from her voice. Judge Thompson addressed Maria. Ms. Rodriguez, has any sum of money been extended in exchange for your testimony? Maria hesitated, her gaze shifting between Marcus and Jenkins. No, she whispered. No, it hasn't. Jenkins smirked. Are you confident in that assertion, Ms. Rodriguez? Utterly confident? A pause for emphasis. I have grounds to believe that you were offered a substantial incentive in return for your testimony from, shall we say, interested parties with a vested interest in securing Emily Carter's acquittal. Maria dissolved into tears. It's untrue, she sobbed. I'm rendering a truthful account. I swear it. Jenkins turned toward the jury, triumph radiating from her face. No further examination from this counsel, Your Honor. Marcus moved to the witness stand, his heart weighed down. He recognized that Jenkins had exerted every effort to impugn Maria, to portray her as a liar and a pawn. But he also recognized that Maria was speaking truthfully. He could see it reflected in her eyes. He had to attempt to salvage the situation. Ms. Rodriguez, he started gently. What ultimately compelled you to step forward at this juncture? Maria looked at him, gratitude welling. Because the weight of the truth became unbearable. She sobbed. I couldn't bear to permit an innocent woman to be sentenced for a crime she didn't enact. I recognized it as ethical to step forward, despite the associated risks. It became necessary to share the truth. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with respect. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez, he affirmed. Thank you for revealing the truth. He addressed Judge Thompson. Your Honor, no further questions from this side. As Maria Rodriguez left the witness stand, tears etched on her face, palpable tension settled over the courtroom. The impact of her testimony couldn't be denied. She had sown the seeds of uncertainty and suspicion in the minds of those watching. Only time would tell if those seeds would blossom into a full acquittal. Jenkins looked rattled, her carefully constructed narrative beginning to fray at the edges. Judge. Integrity on trial. Jenkins' composure, meticulously constructed over weeks, threatened to shatter like glass. A mere street vendor and a down-on-his-luck lawyer were dismantling her airtight case right before her eyes. A flush crept up her neck. Ms. Rodriguez, she began, her tone laced with disdain. You profess to recognize Detective Miller's voice. Perhaps you can illuminate the court as to how a humble purveyor of coffee is so intimately acquainted with the vocal characteristics of a seasoned officer of the law? Maria squared her shoulders, meeting Jenkins' gaze unflinchingly. I run my cart near the precinct, ma'am. I hear him yammering on his cell constantly. A foghorn. Hard to miss that bellow. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Jenkins, refusing to acknowledge the shifting attention and hushed conjectures, persisted. And you are absolutely certain, beyond any doubt, that it was Detective Miller's voice you distinguished amidst the pandemonium of a robbery? Positive, ma'am. Crystal clear. Maria's voice held firm. He was barking orders at someone, telling them to step on it. Jenkins curled her lip. Barking? You expect the court to swallow the notion that a decorated detective was bellowing instructions during a meticulously planned heist? She paused, letting the absurdity of the notion sink in. Isn't it far more likely, Ms. Rodriguez, that you're simply mistaken? Or perhaps, persuaded by ulterior motives to concoct this preposterous tale? Marcus shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor! Counsel is badgering the witness and leveling unsubstantiated accusations. Judge Thompson, his expression an impassive mask, sustained the objection. Ms. Jenkins, rephrase, please. Jenkins shot daggers at Marcus before refocusing on Maria. Ms. Rodriguez, do you possess any prior acquaintance with the defendant, Emily Carter? No, ma'am. Or, perchance, with Marcus Bell, her legal counsel? Maria hesitated, a microsecond, but enough for Jenkins to capitalize. Well, I bought a coffee from him once or twice when his office was near the courthouse. So you concede you know him. Isn't it plausible that Mr. Bell, aware of your proximity to the event, convinced you to step forward with this elaborate fiction? Objection. Counsel is engaging in pure speculation, Marcus declared, his voice like honed steel. Judge Thompson sighed, the sound carrying a hint of weariness. Sustained. Ms. Jenkins, this line of inquiry is proving unproductive. Confine yourself to the pertinent facts. Jenkins, frustration etched on her features, shifted her approach. Ms. Rodriguez, let's discuss your enterprise. You vend coffee from a pushcart, correct? Yes, ma'am. And is this a licensed enterprise? Do you possess all the necessary authorizations and certifications? A shadow crossed Maria's face. I'm in the process of obtaining them. Jenkins' smile was predatory, her eyes gleaming with triumph. So you admit to operating an unregistered business? An enterprise that could be shut down instantaneously by the authorities? She allowed the unspoken threat to resonate. Wouldn't you concede, Ms. Rodriguez, that you might be inclined to say virtually anything to evade such consequences? Marcus was on his feet again, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Objection! Harassment! Counsel is clearly attempting to intimidate the witness. This time, Judge Thompson's voice resonated with steel. Ms. Jenkins, you are treading dangerously close to contempt. One further outburst of this nature, and I will hold you in contempt. Limit your questions to the actual events of the robbery. Jenkins, defeated for now but far from broken, reluctantly retreated. No further questions, Your Honor. Maria descended from the witness stand, her face drained of color but her eyes still radiating defiance. As she passed Marcus, she offered a small, grateful nod. He returned it, a spark of hope kindling within him. In the courtroom's rear, Detective Ray Maxwell observed the proceedings with mounting misgivings. He had partnered with Jenkins for years, recognizing her as a tenacious prosecutor, but something about her performance felt off-kilter, more intensely personal. It left a bad taste in his mouth. His gaze shifted to Detective Miller, who sat ashen-faced at the prosecution table. Miller hadn't uttered a peep since Maria's testimony, and his characteristic swagger had vanished. Maxwell noticed beads of perspiration gathering on Miller's brow. Following a short recess, Jenkins summoned Detective Miller to the stand. Maxwell watched his progress toward the witness box, his movements jerky, almost robotic. Detective Miller, Jenkins began, her voice regaining its usual self-assuredness. Can you recount for the court your involvement in the investigation of the Carter and Sons jewelers robbery? Miller cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the silent courtroom. Yes, ma'am. I was among the first officers to arrive at the scene. I assisted in securing the perimeter and gathering evidence. And did you, at any point during the robbery, enter the jewelry store itself? No, ma'am. I remained outside throughout the entire incident. Did you speak to anyone while the robbery was in progress? I spoke to fellow officers, coordinating our response. Did you shout any instructions, or otherwise communicate loudly, during the robbery? No, ma'am. My tone was conversational. Jenkins turned toward the jury, her expression a mask of righteous indignation. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Detective Miller has categorically denied the accusations leveled by Ms. Rodriguez. It is patently clear that her testimony is nothing more than a contrivance, designed to mislead this court and obstruct justice. Maxwell shifted uneasily. He knew Miller was a capable officer, but he also understood that officers sometimes bent the rules, particularly when convinced they were acting for the greater good. He resolved to speak with Jenkins. During the next brief break, Maxwell intercepted Jenkins in the corridor. Sarah, a word? Jenkins turned, her expression guarded and wary. What is it, Ray? I'm not liking where this is going, Maxwell said, his voice low and urgent. That Rodriguez woman, she came across as genuinely convinced. And Miller, he looked like he was about to lose his lunch on the stand. Jenkins scoffed, the sound sharp in the confined space. She's a liar, Ray. A desperate woman trying to dodge the consequences of operating an illegal business. And Miller is merely rattled by being falsely accused. Maybe, Maxwell countered, unconvinced. But I've been in this game too long, Sarah. I have a gut feeling about this, and it's screaming that something stinks. Jenkins sighed, the sound laced with exasperation. Ray, I appreciate your concern, but I have a handle on this. We have a solid case against Emily Carter, and I will not allow some coffee vendor to derail it. But what if she's telling the truth? Maxwell pressed. What if Miller really was involved? Jenkins' eyes ignited with anger, twin points of fire. Don't be absurd, Ray. Miller would never stoop to something like that. I hope you're right, Sarah, Maxwell said, his voice hardening with resolve. Because if it transpires that he was involved, and you knew about it, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Jenkins scrutinized him for a long moment, her face paling. Are you threatening me, Ray? No, Maxwell said, his voice devoid of emotion. I'm simply reminding you that we have a solemn obligation to uphold the law. And that includes ensuring we're not sending an innocent woman to prison. He turned and walked away, leaving Jenkins standing alone in the hallway, her face a study in conflicting emotions, fury and uncertainty warring for dominance. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere crackled with suppressed electricity. The gallery buzzed with conjecture, and even Judge Thompson seemed more engaged than usual. He had presided over countless cases during his tenure, but something about this one felt different, heavier. The very air seemed to hum with anticipation. Marcus watched Jenkins as she resumed her interrogation of Detective Miller. He could discern the strain etched on her face, the barely contained fury smoldering in her eyes. He knew he had unnerved her, that he had sown seeds of doubt within the jury's minds. However, he also knew Jenkins was a formidable adversary, and she wouldn't surrender easily. He glanced toward Emily, seated at the defense table, her face pale but her eyes now holding a fragile glimmer of hope. He knew he still had a long, arduous journey ahead, but for the first time since accepting this case, he sensed he might actually have a fighting chance. A chance to demonstrate Emily's innocence, a chance to expose the rot that had infected the legal system, and a chance to finally reclaim his own tarnished reputation. The magnitude of that responsibility weighed heavily on him, but he was prepared. He was ready to wage war for justice, even if it meant challenging the entire apparatus of the law. He was prepared to gamble everything, even his own freedom, to ensure the right prevailed. The trial continued, transforming the courtroom into a battleground. Jenkins fought with relentless intensity to safeguard her case, while Marcus battled with equal fervor to unveil the truth. The stakes were monumental, and the outcome remained uncertain. But one thing was indisputable: the fight for justice had only just begun. A judge's dilemma. The mahogany of Judge Theodore Thompson's desk felt like an isolating expanse. The familiar blend of aged leather and lemon polish, usually a balm, pressed down on him like a shroud. He tugged at his tie. The knot felt like a tightening vice. The Carter case. It was a persistent ache in his conscience. Sleep had been elusive. Maria's wavering testimony played on loop in his thoughts. Detective Miller, a seasoned officer celebrated for his thoroughness. Thompson had long prized diligence. Yet Maria's account conjured a troubling image: coercion, a story being hammered into shape. He pivoted in his chair, the aged leather groaning beneath him, and gazed at the sprawling cityscape. Car headlights became darting sparks below, indifferent to the inner storm raging within the courthouse walls. He'd always imagined himself an anchor in the storm, a beacon of fair judgment. Lately, though, the bedrock of his conviction felt unstable. Marcus Bell. The very name sent a ripple of disquiet through him. An ex-con who had challenged authority, now standing before him, questioning the foundations with unsettling skill. Initially, Thompson had written him off as a charlatan, a drowning man clutching at straws. But Bell had persisted, tenacious and relentless. Maria's testimony was the culmination of that grit. He kneaded his temples, fighting the mounting pressure. He re-examined the trial, scrutinizing each witness, every exhibit, and each objection. Jenkins, usually composed and self-assured, had appeared, flustered. And Bell, against all odds, possessed a disconcerting level of calm. He rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He needed to move, to untangle the knot in his brain. He traversed the room, his steps absorbed by the dense Persian rug. Was he being manipulated? Was Bell a puppet master, spinning a web of deceit to liberate his associate? He paused again at the window, his reflection staring back. A man haunted by doubt, questioning the very pillars of his profession. He recalled his father, a paragon of integrity who had instilled in him reverence for the law. He had aspired to mirror him, to champion the principles of justice. But what if that justice was tainted? What if the system he had dedicated his life to was corrupt? He raked a hand through his thinning hair. He couldn't dismiss the persistent sensation that something was deeply wrong. The puzzle pieces didn't align correctly. Miller's report, Jenkins' reactions, Bell's unwavering resolve. It pointed towards something more sinister. He considered the repercussions. If Emily Carter was innocent, a profound injustice was unfolding. And he, Theodore Thompson, would be an accomplice. The notion was repugnant. However, acknowledging Bell's sharp legal acumen, admitting that he, a seasoned judge, had miscalculated, was difficult to accept. It would mean conceding that the system he had blindly trusted might be flawed. It would erode his own sense of authority. He stopped pacing and confronted his reflection in the mirror. He observed the fatigue in his eyes, the lines framing his mouth, the weight of responsibility etched on his face. "Damn it!" he muttered, the words barely audible. He wheeled around and returned to his desk, resolve hardening his movements. He hit the intercom. "Bring me the Carter file," he told his clerk, his tone firm. He needed to examine everything anew, every document, transcript, and piece of evidence. He needed to unearth the truth, however disconcerting it might be. The file arrived shortly, a hefty stack of papers secured in a manila folder. He opened it and began to read, brow furrowed in concentration. He delved into the details, hunting for discrepancies, overlooked clues. As he read, his focus shifted, focusing on the individuals involved. He reread Miller's testimony, paying scrupulous attention to his phrasing and tone. He reviewed Jenkins' opening and closing arguments, noting the subtle variations in her presentation. And he re-examined Bell's cross-examination, marveling at his strategic questioning, his ability to expose the frailties in the prosecution's case. He leaned back, his mind spinning. He needed to observe them outside the staged environment of the courtroom. He needed to gauge their reactions, discern their true sentiments. He made a decision. He would observe the proceedings tomorrow from the gallery. Any judge could observe any trial, and perhaps a different vantage point would yield greater clarity. The following day, Thompson slipped into the courtroom undetected, choosing a seat at the rear of the gallery. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The jury was soon expected to begin deliberations. He watched Bell consult with Emily Carter, their heads close. He perceived the worry etched on Bell's face, the determination in his eyes. There was something about the man, an unvarnished intensity, that Thompson struggled to decipher. Genuine concern for his client, or something else entirely? Next, he turned his gaze to Jenkins, seated at the prosecution's table, her face ashen. She stared forward, jaw set. He sensed the tension radiating from her, barely suppressed anger. She met his gaze briefly, and he detected a flicker in her expression. Fear? Defiance? He couldn't pinpoint it. He watched as the jury filed out to begin their process. The room became hushed. The only sound was the hum of the lights above. Bell turned, his gaze scanning the gallery. His eyes met Thompson's, locking for a moment. Thompson saw something in Bell's gaze, a plea, a challenge, a glimmer of hope. He looked away swiftly, feeling a sudden wave of unease. He sat there for what felt like an age, watching, waiting, observing. He saw the anxiety twisting Emily Carter's features, the restless energy in Bell's movements, the simmering frustration etched in Jenkins' stance. He observed the human drama, the destinies hanging in the balance. And he knew, with growing conviction, that he could not simply stand by and allow the system to follow its course. He had a responsibility, a duty, to ensure justice was done. He arose and left the courtroom, his mind settled. He would initiate an independent inquiry into the Carter case. He would re-interview witnesses, re-examine evidence, leaving no avenue unexplored. He would find the truth, regardless of the implications. He returned to his chambers, his steps now firm and determined. He felt a purpose that had been dormant for years. He was no longer solely a judge, a dispenser of legal judgments. He was an investigator, a pursuer of truth, a champion of justice. He sat at his desk and picked up the phone. He dialed a number he hadn't touched in years, the number of a retired detective whom he trusted implicitly, a man known for his integrity and a relentless pursuit of facts. "I need your help," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I have a case that needs fresh eyes. Desperate measures." Sweat beaded on ADA Sarah Jenkins' forehead, despite the cool linen of her tailored jacket. The courtroom, ordinarily a haven filled with the predictable cadence of legal proceedings, now pressed in on her, stifling and close. News of Thompson's independent inquiry had struck with the force of a gavel, shaking the foundations of her carefully built career, threatening exposure. Recapturing the advantage was paramount, and haste essential. Her gaze sharpened as Marcus Bell addressed the assembly of jurors, his voice ringing with a conviction that grated on her nerves. He was portraying Emily Carter as wrong, not guilty, and the jury seemed captivated. The narrative had to shift. It had to shift quickly. "Your Honor," Jenkins began, her tone honed to a razor's edge, masking her inner turmoil. "The prosecution wishes to submit a statement from Brenda Miller, an inmate who shared a cell with the defendant, concerning Ms. Carter's purported admission." Bell's head jerked up, his expression a study in surprise and wary skepticism. "Objection, Your Honor. The court is aware that testimony extracted from a cellmate is fraught with credibility concerns and lacks any supporting validation." Ignoring the interruption momentarily, Jenkins forged ahead. "Ms. Miller alleges that Ms. Carter divulged details of her involvement in the crime, expressing subsequent regret. She recognized the precariousness of her position. The cellmate's account was flimsy at best, obtained under dubious circumstances and ripe for challenge. But desperation had a way of blurring moral lines." "Your Honor," Bell reiterated, his voice hardening to steel, "this is inadmissible hearsay. Furthermore, the prosecution has failed to substantiate Ms. Miller's claims. We have no means to ascertain their veracity, and its introduction at this juncture is clearly designed to prejudice the jury." Judge Thompson, who had observed the exchange with growing apprehension, leaned forward, his gaze locked on Jenkins. The lines on his face seemed more deeply carved, accentuated by the gravity settling over the room. "Ms. Jenkins," he stated, his voice low but resolute, "can you substantiate the validity and dependability of this testimony?" Jenkins faltered, a flicker of uncertainty betraying her facade. She had foreseen this challenge, but hoped to bulldoze through it by sheer force of office. Thompson's unexpected scrutiny had unsettled her. "Your Honor, we maintain that Ms. Miller's account is pertinent and carries significant weight. She was in close proximity to the defendant and had ample opportunity to overhear a confession. Relevance and probative force are insufficient, Ms. Jenkins," Thompson countered, his tone sharpening. "You are well aware of the established legal criteria for admitting this kind of evidence. You must establish its reliability. Have you vetted Ms. Miller's background? Investigated potential biases or vested interests she might possess?" Jenkins stammered. We are assured of Ms. Miller's credibility, Your Honor." The fabrication left a sour residue in her mouth. A thorough vetting hadn't been a priority, securing a swift victory had been. Bell pounced. "Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to introduce testimony that is not only inadmissible but potentially invented. This is a blatant infringement of the defendant's entitlement to a fair trial." Thompson's jaw tightened. A surge of anger coursed through him, directed not only at Jenkins but at his own inaction. The system, the bedrock of his professional life, was being twisted to serve a malicious purpose, and he had, through inaction, enabled it. Looking at Emily Carter, her features pale and worn, a wave of remorse engulfed him. "Ms. Jenkins," Thompson announced, his tone imbued with newfound resolve, "Mr. Bell's objection is sustained. The cellmate testimony is deemed inadmissible." Furthermore, his eyes holding her captive. I caution you, Ms. Jenkins. Your conduct during this trial has raised serious concerns. I expect strict adherence to the rules of evidence and proper procedure. Any further attempts to introduce inadmissible evidence or engage in unethical tactics will result in severe repercussions. Is that perfectly clear? Jenkins, her face aflame with mortification and rage, offered only a curt nod. A hush descended on the courtroom, every gaze pinned on her. She had been publicly censured, her authority eroded. The carefully constructed edifice of her career was collapsing around her. As Jenkins stumbled through the remainder of her questioning, Bell observed a perceptible shift in the jury's attitude. Seeds of doubt had been sown, undermining their prior acceptance of the prosecution's narrative. The balance was tilting, slowly but unmistakably. Later that night, Judge Thompson sat alone within the confines of his chambers, the day's burdens weighing heavily on him. Immersed in the trial transcripts, he meticulously analyzed every word, every gesture, every nuance. He dissected Jenkins's performance, scrutinizing her arguments and tactics. He discerned a pattern of manipulation, a willingness to subvert the rules, privileging conviction above justice. He also re-examined the documents pertaining to Detective Miller's investigation. The more he probed, the more discrepancies emerged. Conflicting witness statements, evidence that seemed neglected, an overall feeling of incompleteness. Miller's exhaustive investigation now appeared more like a perfunctory attempt to prematurely close the case. Thompson reached for the telephone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, belonging to Frank O'Malley, a retired detective and former colleague whom he trusted implicitly. Frank, he said, his voice laced with weariness. I need a favor. I need you to look into something for me. It's about a case, the Emily Carter case. Meanwhile, across town, in a dimly illuminated tavern, Jenkins nursed a whiskey, her fury simmering beneath a facade of composure. Her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown sender. Meet me. Same place. Midnight. She knew who it was. She'd anticipated this moment. The bargain struck, the compromises accepted, were about to exact their price. She finished her drink and motioned the bartender for another. She had crossed a point of no return. As midnight approached, Jenkins arrived at the rendezvous, the same unremarkable establishment where the Carter case had first been broached. She discovered him in the back booth, cloaked in shadow, his features obscured by the subdued light. He was Sal DeMarco, a known associate of the Falcone crime family. You seem troubled, Sarah, DeMarco said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Is there a snag in the Carter case? Jenkins hesitated, weighing her options. She could try to disengage, confess everything. But she knew that would lead to professional and perhaps physical obliteration. She was in too deep. Thompson's growing suspicious, she admitted, her voice barely audible. He's launched an independent inquiry. DeMarco's eyes narrowed into slits. That's unacceptable. The Carter case must remain closed. It's too important. I know, Jenkins responded, her voice tinged with desperation. But I don't know what to do. Thompson's monitoring my every move. DeMarco leaned closer, his voice descending to a conspiratorial whisper. There are ways to persuade him. Ways to make him see reason. Jenkins swallowed hard, her stomach nodding. She understood the implications. She had skirted the edges of corruption for years, but this particular boundary had remained uncrossed. I don't know if I can do that, she stammered. DeMarco chuckled, a cold, desolate sound. You have no choice, Sarah. You made a pact. And we expect it to be honored. He paused, allowing his words to penetrate. Think of your career, Sarah. Think of your prospects. And consider the potential consequences should you fail us. Jenkins departed the bar, nauseated. She had reached a critical juncture. She could persist along this path of moral decay, jeopardizing everything for the sake of her ambition. Or she could attempt to break free, expose the truth, even if it meant forfeiting all she had achieved. Back at his apartment, Marcus Bell sat at his computer, analyzing case documents and witness statements. He had requested complete access to the case files, and although Jenkins had initially resisted, Thompson's intervention had compelled her compliance. He was searching for anything to support his suspicion that Emily Carter had been set up. He focused on the fiscal records of the victim, a wealthy businessman named Arthur Sterling. Sterling had cultivated numerous adversaries during his lifetime, and Bell suspected that one of them had masterminded his murder, positioning Emily Carter as the scapegoat. As he went deeper into the records, Bell noticed a sequence of anomalous transactions, substantial sums being wired to offshore accounts. He traced these back to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary of the corporation remained unknown. Bell felt a surge of adrenaline. He was onto something. He had uncovered a promising lead, a thread that could potentially unravel the entire web of deceit. He simply needed to pull it. But as he reached for the phone to contact his investigator, he detected a sound just outside his door. A scraping noise, as if someone were trying to force the lock. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew he was under surveillance. He knew he was in danger. He reached for the handgun he kept secreted beneath his pillow, his hand trembling. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer solely about proving Emily Carter's innocence. It was about self-preservation, anticipation, and counter. A taut stillness gripped the courtroom, a palpable tension that draped itself over the spectators like a heavy curtain. Marcus, bearing the immense weight of Emily's fate, stood composed at the defense table. Hours he had spent dissecting Jenkins' strategy, anticipating the prosecutor's desperation, her propensity to twist, or shatter, protocol. His rebuttal was meticulously constructed, a bulwark of jurisprudence designed to repel the oncoming attack. Across the room, Jenkins paced before the jury box, her face a mask of defiance battling barely concealed apprehension. Sunlight, fractured by the tall windows, caught the sharp angles of her power suit, yet failed to conceal the tremor that ran through her hands as she shuffled papers. Thompson's rebuke had cut deeper than anticipated, festering into a poisoned wound. The courthouse whispers, the furtive glances from colleagues, were a constant, corrosive reminder of her precarious standing. DeMarco's veiled threats hung like a sword above her head, exacerbating the pressure. She craved victory, and she needed it now. Her voice, when it came, was a strained echo of its usual assuredness. Your Honor, the prosecution requests leave to recall Mrs. Evelyn Hayes to the witness stand. Fresh evidence has surfaced, directly relevant to the defendant's character and potential motivation. A jolt of adrenaline surged through Marcus. Hayes, the jailhouse informant. He had foreseen such a maneuver, a reckless gambit skirting ethical boundaries. Rising to his feet, he projected an aura of controlled force. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is attempting to introduce character defamation that is both irrelevant and profoundly prejudicial. Mrs. Hayes' testimony was previously ruled inadmissible, and no legitimate grounds have been offered to justify revisiting that decision. Judge Thompson leaned back, his gaze a keen blade. He, too, had anticipated this. He had observed Jenkins' performance throughout the proceedings with growing concern, detecting the desperation simmering beneath her polished veneer. Ms. Jenkins, he stated, his voice the very embodiment of judicial authority. Elucidate the basis for recalling Mrs. Hayes. What novel information warrants this request? Jenkins swallowed hard, her eyes flicking nervously towards the jury. Your Honor, subsequent to Mrs. Hayes' initial deposition, we obtained corroborating details regarding Ms. Carter's inclination towards aggression and acute financial need. This evidence significantly reinforces Mrs. Hayes' account of Ms. Carter confessing to the crime. Marcus advanced, his voice a sharp counterpoint to Jenkins' carefully crafted tale. With respect, Your Honor, the prosecution seeks to circumvent established rules of evidence. This so-called corroborating evidence is pure conjecture and hearsay. It's a blatant attempt to poison the minds of the jury against my client with unsubstantiated rumors and innuendo. A pause to let the implication settle. Moreover, I submit that the prosecution is deliberately concealing the nature of this corroborating evidence because it will not stand up to scrutiny. Thompson's eyebrow arched, intrigued. Mr. Bell, do you suspect the prosecution is suppressing information? Marcus' gaze locked with the judge's. I do, Your Honor. I have reason to believe that the prosecution is relying on information that is not only inadmissible but potentially fabricated. I request an immediate hearing to ascertain the admissibility of this corroborating evidence before Mrs. Hayes is permitted to testify. A flush of crimson stained Jenkins' face. She had underestimated Marcus' preparedness, his willingness to confront her head-on. Her hope had been to subtly introduce the testimony, swaying the jury with evocative rhetoric before the defense could mount an effective objection. Your Honor, she stammered, Mr. Bell is making baseless accusations. The prosecution has acted in good faith and retains every right to present pertinent evidence to the court. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle. A court officer cleared his throat, the sound magnified in the stillness. The jurors shifted, their faces registering a blend of curiosity and apprehension. Thompson steepled his fingers, his expression in enigma. Ms. Jenkins, I find myself increasingly troubled by the trajectory of this trial. The introduction of Mrs. Hayes' testimony was already questionable. Now, Mr. Bell alleges that the prosecution is withholding information and possibly resorting to fabricated evidence. This is a grave assertion. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Bell, can you provide concrete examples to support your claim? Marcus nodded, extracting a file from his briefcase. Yes, Your Honor. In the interest of transparency and to uphold the integrity of these proceedings, I wish to present evidence that the prosecution is aware of inconsistencies and omissions in the financial records pertaining to the deceased, Mr. Harding. Records that, if properly examined, would cast profound doubt on the prosecution's narrative. He approached the bench, handing the file to the clerk, who in turn presented it to Judge Thompson. The judge swiftly reviewed the documents, his brow creasing. These were the very financial anomalies Marcus had been pursuing, the irregularities that had led him to suspect a deeper truth behind Harding's death. He noted the wire transfers to shadowy accounts, the unexplained cash infusions, the artful obfuscation of financial pathways. It was damning indeed. Thompson's gaze returned to Jenkins, his eyes like chips of glacial ice. Ms. Jenkins, were you aware of these financial discrepancies? Jenkins paled, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. She knew the trap had sprung. So fixated on securing a conviction, on silencing Emily Carter, she had overlooked the glaring contradictions within the financial data. DeMarco had cautioned her against delving into them, urging her to concentrate on circumstantial evidence. But she had failed to grasp the extent of the deception. Your Honor, she confessed weakly. I was apprised of certain anomalies, but I was led to believe they were inconsequential to the case. Inconsequential? Thompson's voice thundered, echoing through the chamber. These documents suggest a pattern of financial duplicity and potential criminal enterprise. How can you possibly deem them immaterial? He brought the gavel down with a resounding crack, the sound reverberating. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Ms. Jenkins, I expect a full and comprehensive explanation for your actions. And Mr. Bell, he added, turning to Marcus, I commend you for bringing this to my attention. The quest for justice demands vigilance and a dedication to uncovering the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it may be. As the courtroom emptied, a murmuring tide of hushed speculation filled the void. The jurors filed out, their faces etched with uncertainty and suspicion. Reporters scrambled for position, eager to transmit news of the day's dramatic developments. Frozen at the prosecution table, Jenkins watched as her career teetered on the brink. DeMarco's retribution would be swift and merciless. She had failed him, and she knew the price would be steep. Marcus, a wave of relief mingling with exhaustion, gathered his documents. He had deflected Jenkins' assault, but the war was far from won. He had exposed the financial improprieties, but he still had to establish Emily's innocence. And he knew that the powerful forces that had orchestrated her predicament were not likely to concede defeat easily. From the defendant's chair, Emily watched Marcus, her eyes alight with gratitude and nascent hope. For the first time since her arrest, a spark of optimism flickered within her. Marcus was fighting for her, unearthing the truth, and exposing the corruption that had led to her wrongful accusation. She knew the journey ahead would be arduous, but she was no longer alone. As Marcus departed the courtroom, he felt the prickling sensation of being watched. He glanced back to see a figure lurking near the exit, his features obscured by the shadows. He was tall and imposing, radiating a chilling, predatory aura. Marcus recognized him instantly. A soldier in DeMarco's army, a silent message warning him that he was venturing into dangerous territory. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. He would not be cowed. He had come too far, risked too much, to yield now. He would continue his fight for Emily, to expose the corruption, and to seek justice, even if it meant facing the full might of the criminal network. He knew the stakes were high, but he was prepared to pay the price. He had an obligation to fulfill, a wrong to correct, and a promise to keep. The battle for Emily's freedom, and his own redemption, had only just begun. He had predicted Jenkins' feint, countered with a carefully prepared legal response. But he knew that the true riposte, the one that would ultimately secure victory, lay in exposing the dark heart of the conspiracy that had trapped them all. Closing arguments. The courtroom atmosphere was a suffocating blanket of expectation. Sunlight, filtered through begrimed panes, slashed spectral shapes across the jury enclosure. Emily, ramrod straight, riveted her gaze on Marcus, a fragile ember of hope flickering against the drab backdrop of her exhaustion. He stood as her bulwark, the potential ruin, or redemption, of her existence balanced precariously on his shoulders. The hush was absolute, save for the metronomic pulse of an ancient clock above the bench, each tick a hammer blow threatening to shatter the remaining fragments of Emily's liberty. Marcus drew a long breath, inhaling the musty air redolent of aged law books and established precedent. He adjusted his rented suit, a small act of self-assurance undermined by the subtle tremble in his fingers. He began softly, his voice imbued with genuine feeling. For these many weeks, you have been present, patiently absorbing testimony, scrutinizing exhibits, navigating a labyrinth of information. You've studied graphs, considered expert analysis, and witnessed the tireless tug-of-war of courtroom strategy. But I implore you now, to pierce through the complexities, to look past the legal terminology, and find the core truth of this matter. He paused, his gaze sweeping the panel, seeking some glint of comprehension, some spark of connection. This extends beyond figures in a ledger or contradictory accounts. This concerns Emily Carter, a woman wrongly accused, a woman whose life has been unfairly decimated. Jenkins, a study in controlled disdain, occupied the prosecution's table. She shifted, a barely perceptible movement, but Marcus registered it. He sensed her eagerness to interrupt, to sabotage his momentum, yet she remained restrained by protocol, for the moment. He pressed on, his voice gaining resonance. The prosecution has constructed a narrative, a carefully woven tapestry intended to portray Emily as a heartless, calculating offender. They've leveled accusations, presented suggestive evidence, and leaned heavily on the word of a prison snitch, a man whose integrity has been utterly, undeniably, compromised. He approached the jury box, his eyes meeting those of a young woman, her brow creased in thought. Recall Mr. Krill? Remember the eagerness with which he testified, the ease with which he fabricated his story of Emily's alleged confession. But also recall what we exposed, the financial anomalies, the unexplained deposits into his account, the transparent and compelling reason for his falsehoods. He directed their attention to the financial documents, now illuminated on a screen. The prosecution claims Emily illicitly transferred funds from the victim's accounts. But where is the tangible proof? They bombarded you with intricate reports, yet concealed the discrepancies in the victim's financial dealings. The deposits followed by withdrawals. The pattern of hidden transactions. These were not the actions of an innocent party, but someone with secrets to guard. He indicated a specific transaction, highlighted in crimson. This wire transfer, almost a year prior to the incident, funneled through an offshore corporation in the Caymans. Does that strike you as a routine business expense? Or does it hint at something far more sinister, something Emily stumbled upon, Something that made her a target? Marcus distanced himself from the screen, his voice modulating to a gentler tone. The prosecution asserts that Emily possessed motive. They claim she was avaricious, driven, prepared to commit any act for financial gain. But I ask you, consider Emily. Examine her character. Listen to the accounts of her friends, her colleagues, those who truly know her. Does she embody the traits of a ruthless killer? Or does she appear as a woman enmeshed in a web of deception, a woman who has become a pawn? He drifted toward Emily, his hand extended, though not touching, a gesture of silent solidarity. Emily Carter is not flawless. She has erred, as we all do. But she is not a murderer. She is a casualty of circumstance, a victim of a system that too often values triumph over fairness. He turned back to the jury, his voice ringing with conviction. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the central issue before you, justice. Not adherence to procedure, not minute details, not concocted stories. But true, unadulterated justice. He paused, allowing his words to permeate the room. The prosecution has rested its case on supposition, on conjecture, and on the declarations of a proven deceiver. They have failed to produce a single piece of solid evidence connecting Emily to this crime. He gestured towards the prosecution table. They seek to have you extrapolate, to draw conclusions based on their assumptions. But I beseech you, resist. Do not convict Emily Carter based on suspicion. Do not sentence her to incarceration because the prosecution has failed to meet its burden. His voice intensified. We reside in a society that prides itself on impartiality, on equitable treatment under the law. But what meaning does that hold if the system is compromised? What meaning if the scales are weighted in favor of those with clout and authority? He paused, his eyes blazing with righteous indignation. What meaning if blameless individuals are sacrificed to preserve the facade of order? He reminded them of the previously undisclosed evidence revealed during the trial. We've scrutinized the suppressed financial data, the conveniently ignored discrepancies, the witness intimidation. This is not about finding the truth. This is about shielding someone, some powerful organization, at Emily's cost. He slowly traversed the courtroom, his voice echoing with a profound faith in the core tenets of justice. Every individual, without regard to their origins, without regard to their situation, is entitled to a fair hearing. Every individual is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. This is the foundation of our legal structure. This is what distinguishes us from despotism. He met each juror's gaze, his own unwavering. I am confident that you have been diligent in your attention. I am confident that you have been receptive to all evidence presented with impartial minds and compassionate hearts. And I am confident that you will render the appropriate verdict. He paused, inhaling deeply. It is said that justice is blind. But I contend that it should be sharp-sighted. It should discern the truth, it should weigh the evidence justly, and it should not be influenced by prejudice or bias. He lowered his voice, speaking with hushed intensity. The prosecution has not demonstrated Emily's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Indeed, they have not demonstrated her guilt at all. They have presented a case constructed of illusion, a case designed to mislead and misdirect you. He approached the jury box, his voice barely audible. I urge you now to penetrate the deceit, to look beyond the superficial, to seek the truth. He straightened, his voice resounding with finality. I ask you to return a verdict of not guilty, not only for Emily Carter, but for the sake of justice itself, for the sake of our legal institutions, for the sake of our collective integrity. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping the room, finally resting on Emily. He offered a small, reassuring smile. Thank you. The ensuing silence was profound. Every eye focused on the jury. The gravity of their decision hung palpably in the air, a force that seemed to weigh upon all present. Marcus resumed his seat, his heart hammering. He avoided Emily's gaze, afraid of revealing his anxiety. He knew he had done all he could. Now, it rested with them. Jenkins rose deliberately, her expression composed, though a flicker of disquiet betrayed her. She addressed the jury, her voice precise and cutting, preparing to dismantle Marcus's impassioned defense. The defense has painted a canvas, a meticulously constructed narrative designed to divert you from the truth. She paused, her gaze sweeping the jury, her voice laced with scorn. Do not be swayed by his theatrics. Do not be deceived by his sentimental appeals. The contest for Emily Carter's liberation remained unresolved. The jury's deliberation would be the ultimate test, the final act in this high-stakes drama. As Jenkins launched into her summation, apprehension clenched in Marcus's gut. He knew that despite the favorable evidence, the forces against them were powerful. He could only hope that the jury, faced with the stark reality of the situation, would choose fairness over legalism, verity over expediency. The lives of innocents and the honor of the law hung precariously. The weight of justice. The courtroom door slammed, a percussive blast that cut through the hushed anticipation, imprisoning Emily Carter within the collective judgment of 12 souls. The jury deliberated. Marcus couldn't remain seated. He patrolled the slender space between the defense table and the gallery, the threadbare carpet absorbing his restless energy, echoing the anxieties of those who'd waited before. Each clock tick reverberated like a death knell. He mentally replayed his summation, scrutinizing every word, every intonation, questioning if he'd done enough to sow seeds of doubt in their minds. Had he peeled back the layers of deception enough to reveal the truth? He glanced at Judge Thompson, ramrod straight on the bench, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the paneled walls. His rigid posture, the tautness of his jaw, betrayed his inner turmoil. Marcus suspected Thompson was wrestling with his own misgivings, his own role in the trial's trajectory. Previously, the judge had been an immovable force, an exemplar of legal propriety. Now, the sheer burden of the decision seemed to diminish him. Inside the jury room, tension hung heavy, a palpable thing. 12 faces, a cross-section of the city's population, each marked by a mixture of trepidation and determination. The foreman, a practical woman with a direct manner, cleared her throat, the sound amplified in the stillness. "Let's commence," she declared, her tone resolute, though tinged with nervousness. "We all understand the stakes." Their initial vote revealed a spectrum of opinions, a mosaic of uncertainty. Guilty. Not guilty. Unconvinced. The true debate had begun. Juror number 8, a pensive young man with wire-framed glasses, leaned back, the prosecutor's accusations still echoing in his mind. Jenkins had been relentless, portraying Emily Carter as a heartless manipulator, driven by avarice. Yet something felt amiss. The evidence felt shaky, the testimonies circumstantial. And then there was Marcus Bell, a man with a checkered past, yes, but someone who argued with a fierce passion that defied easy dismissal. Marcus's words resonated. Justice isn't blind obedience to the rules. It's about uncovering the truth, however deeply concealed. He recalled the withheld financial records, the inconsistencies Marcus had painstakingly exposed. Though not a financial expert, he saw the deliberate obfuscation, the attempt to mislead. Closing his eyes, he sought clarity amidst the chaos, searching for the signal through the static. Was Emily Carter truly culpable, or a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a larger scheme? He opened his eyes, surveying the room. Some jurors wore expressions of firm conviction, their judgments seemingly predetermined. Others appeared hesitant, their eyes reflecting uncertainty. He understood his responsibility to voice his reservations, to ensure they didn't condemn an innocent person. Clearing his throat, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'm not certain. There are too many questions unanswered." Back in the courtroom, the silence intensified, broken only by the city's distant hum filtering through the sealed windows. Marcus ceased his pacing and stood transfixed by the street scene. Passers-by hurried along, oblivious to the drama within, their lives continuing unaffected. He found it both absurd and strangely reassuring. Judge Thompson rose and joined Marcus at the window, their silent presence a shared acknowledgement of the strain. "It rests with them now," Marcus observed quietly. Thompson nodded, his gaze distant. "Indeed." After a pause, he added, "Irrespective of the verdict, Mr. Bell, I intend to initiate an independent inquiry into the issues you raised during this trial." Marcus turned in surprise. You do? I cannot ignore the revelations presented, Thompson stated firmly. There are too many discrepancies, too many unresolved matters. Regardless of Emily Carter's guilt or innocence, the legal process's integrity has been compromised, and that I cannot excuse. A spark of hope ignited within Marcus. He'd gotten through to him. The judge, once seemingly immutable, was now willing to scrutinize his own decisions, to investigate the depths of corruption. Thank you, Your Honor, Marcus said sincerely. That's significant. Thompson nodded once more, his attention returning to the street. It's the least I can do. I have a duty to uphold the law, which includes ensuring justice prevails. The hours stretched into an eternity. Marcus and Judge Thompson remained, their shared anxiety a tangible presence. Court staff carried on, attempting to project normalcy, but the tension permeated the air. Even the very atmosphere seemed charged. Inside, the debate intensified. Juror number 8 persisted in voicing his doubts, challenging assumptions, highlighting flaws in the prosecution's case. He didn't dictate his opinion, but presented his arguments with clarity and conviction. Gradually, some began to falter. They re-examined the evidence, reconsidered the testimonies, and viewed the case through a new lens. Doubts sprouted, undermining their confidence. One by one, votes shifted. The momentum was changing. As twilight enveloped the city, painting the courtroom with somber shades, a court officer approached the bench, whispering to Judge Thompson. The judge's expression shifted. He nodded, then addressed Marcus. They've reached a verdict, he announced, his voice echoing in the stillness. The news spread like wildfire. Anticipation crackled. Spectators straightened, eyes fixed on the jury room door. Emily Carter was escorted back into the courtroom, pale and worn. She sat at the defense table, hands clasped tightly, eyes locked on Marcus. He offered a reassuring nod, yet a sense of foreboding persisted. He had done all he could, but the ultimate outcome remained beyond his reach. The jury filed back in, their faces inscrutable. They resumed their seats, their eyes focused on Judge Thompson. The foreman rose, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the verdict form. Your Honor, she declared, her voice strained but clear. We, the jury, find the defendant. The courtroom held its breath. Every gaze fixed on the foreman, every heart pounding. Not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Emily Carter broke down, burying her face in her hands. A wave of relief overwhelmed Marcus, nearly buckling his knees. He had succeeded. He had saved her. Judge Thompson remained impassive, but Marcus detected a flicker in his eyes, perhaps relief, vindication, or even gratitude. The foreman continued, her voice stronger now. We also wish to express our profound concern regarding the conduct of this trial and the suppression of evidence. We implore the court to launch a thorough investigation into these matters. Thompson nodded gravely. Your concerns are noted, he replied, and I assure you they will be addressed. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. People surged forward to congratulate Emily and Marcus. The oppressive weight of the trial lifted. But Marcus knew this was merely the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. Powerful interests remained at play, and they wouldn't yield easily. Looking at Emily, her face alight with relief, he felt prepared to face the challenges ahead. He had tasted victory, and he was determined to pursue justice, whatever the cost. Judge Thompson observed the scene, wrestling with complex emotions. He had erred. He had been blinded by appearances, by precedent. He had almost condemned an innocent woman. He knew he faced a steep path to redemption. He had to unearth the truth, expose the corruption festering within the legal system, and prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. Rising from the bench, he addressed the courtroom, his voice firm and unwavering. This court is adjourned, he announced. And let the investigation commence. Not guilty. The air in the courtroom hung thick and heavy, each breath a monumental strain. Marcus's gaze locked on the returning jury, their expressions inscrutable. Beside him, Emily's hand, slick with apprehension, trembled in his. He offered a reassuring squeeze, a solace he himself desperately needed. Each second ticked by, a metronome of dread pounding against his skull. Judge Thompson, his countenance a mask of impassivity, addressed the foreman. "Mr. Davies, has the jury reached a decision?" Davies, a man etched with the weariness of middle age, straightened his posture. "We have, Your Honor." A wave of indrawn breath rippled through the gallery. Marcus felt Emily's grip tighten. He scrutinized Davies, seeking any telltale sign, a hint of the verdict to come. His face remained a blank slate. "Please present the verdict to the bailiff," Judge Thompson instructed, his voice lacking its usual commanding presence, now subdued, as though even he held his anticipation captive. The bailiff, a hulking figure perpetually scowling, accepted the sealed envelope and delivered it to the judge. Thompson broke the seal with a deliberate slowness that stretched the tension taut as a bowstring. His eyes darted across the document, flickering almost imperceptibly. Silence reigned, save for the faint drone of the ventilation. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears, a frantic drum solo against the backdrop of agonizing stillness. Thompson cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the hushed chamber. His gaze flickered between Emily and Marcus, lingering for a beat too long on the latter. An unreadable expression crossed his features. Curiosity? Regret? Its meaning remained elusive. "In the matter of the state versus Emily Carter," Judge Thompson began, his voice regaining its customary resonance. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we, the jury, find the defendant." He paused, the silence descending once more, heavier, more oppressive than before. "Not guilty." The words detonated in the courtroom, a singular, searing syllable that shattered the tension, unleashing a torrent of emotion. A collective gasp surged through the crowd, followed by an explosion of sound. Applause, cheers, jubilant cries, a wave of noise crashed over them. Emily dissolved into tears, burying her face against Marcus's shoulder. He embraced her tightly, his own eyes prickling with moisture. A tidal wave of relief washed over him, almost buckling his knees. He had done it. He had actually succeeded. The courtroom dissolved into pandemonium. Emily's kin surged forward, engulfing her in a maelstrom of hugs and tearful exclamations. Marcus found himself besieged by well-wishers, their hands patting his back, their faces beaming with joy. Even certain members of the court staff offered subtle smiles, a tacit acknowledgement of the triumph. Amidst the uproar, Marcus met Judge Thompson's gaze. Still seated on the bench, the judge's face remained enigmatic. He remained aloof from the celebration, merely observing the scene with a contemplative neutrality. For a fleeting moment, Marcus detected a glint of something akin to respect in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Order! Order in the court!" Judge Thompson boomed, his voice slicing through the cacophony. The applause trickled to a halt, replaced by a low murmur of exhilarated chatter. "This court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Marcus guided Emily and her family through the throng. Outside, the air was invigoratingly crisp, a welcome escape from the stale atmosphere within. The sky blazed in azure blue, the sun warm on his face. The very elements seemed to celebrate their victory. Emily clung to his arm, her countenance radiant despite the lingering tears. "Thank you, Marcus," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have managed," Marcus replied, though he knew the assertion rang hollow. "Without him, Emily would likely be behind bars." "No, I wouldn't," she insisted, squeezing his arm. "You believed in me when no one else did." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression. Making a difference felt gratifying, using his skills for something meaningful. It was a far cry from chasing ambulances and seeking facile settlements. Yet, even as he reveled in the afterglow of victory, a persistent disquiet tugged at his mind. This was not the finale. He had exposed a mere fissure in the system, but the corruption ran deep. He needed to persist in his excavation, continue the fight until those culpable faced justice. He glanced back at the courthouse, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the power and malfeasance he confronted. Judge Thompson remained visible through one of the soaring windows, standing sentinel, gazing out at the cityscape. Though the judge's features were obscured by distance, Marcus sensed an internal conflict raging within him. During the trial, he had discerned something in the judge's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a trace of unease. The meticulously constructed edifice of his convictions, his faith in the legal apparatus, had been shaken. Later that evening, Marcus found himself alone in his sparsely furnished apartment. The wind tasted curiously flat, unresolved. He knew Ada Jenkins would be seething, plotting her retribution. He understood that the forces he had antagonized would not simply concede. He poured a measure of whiskey, the amber spirit swirling in the tumbler. He mused on Emily, finally back with her family, liberated from the shadow of accusation. He had returned her life to her. But what of the others? The countless souls wrongly condemned, railroaded by a system that prized conviction rates over equity? He took a long draught, the fiery liquid coursing through his veins. He knew his path. He had to harness his newfound credibility, his reputation as the lawyer who had outmaneuvered the system, to champion those who could not defend themselves. He powered up his laptop and commenced typing. He would meticulously document every discovery, every irregularity, every instance of prosecutorial overreach. He would reveal the corruption that had festered within the justice system for an unconscionable time. Adrenaline and a consuming sense of purpose kept him at his task late into the night. It was a perilous course he had chosen, but there was no turning back. He had glimpsed the truth, and he could not ignore its call. Across town, in chambers perched high above the illuminated sprawl, Judge Theodore Thompson sat solitary, the day's burden weighing heavily upon him. The courtroom lay shrouded in darkness, the sole illumination emanating from a small desk lamp highlighting the documents spread before him. He scrutinized the trial transcripts, analyzing every word, every gesture, every nuance. He had always taken pride in his impartiality, his rigorous adherence to legal precedent. But now, he wrestled with the gnawing feeling that he had erred, that he had been unwittingly manipulated. He thought of Marcus Bell, the disbarred attorney who had dared to challenge him, who had exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case with such skill and fervor. Initially, he had dismissed Bell as a maverick, a mere rabble-rouser. Now, he couldn't help but admire his resilience, his unwavering dedication to fairness. His thoughts also turned to Ada Jenkins, her ambition bordering on ruthlessness, her zeal to win at all costs. He had always regarded her as a star on the rise, a valuable asset to the DA's office. But now, he wondered if her ambition had blinded him, preventing him from seeing the depths to which she would sink to achieve her aims. He closed his eyes, the image of Emily Carter's tear-streaked face searing itself into his memory. He had come perilously close to condemning an innocent woman. The realization struck a devastating blow to his ego, a profound challenge to his very sense of self. He knew what actions he had to take. He had to examine the Carter case with diligence, unearthing the truth no matter where it led. He could no longer turn a blind eye to the anomalies, the contradictions, the troubling doubts that haunted him. He reached for the phone and dialed the number, his hand betraying a slight tremor. He had a reputation to safeguard, a career to preserve. But he could not reconcile himself with abetting injustice. "Hello?" he said, his voice barely audible. "I need to see you. It's about the Carter case." Surprise and hesitation laced the response on the other end. But Judge Thompson pressed on, firm in his resolve. He was going to uncover the truth, even at the cost of everything. The pursuit of justice would begin at this moment. Humility and apology. Judge Thompson remained at his bench, the jury's, "not guilty," still echoing in the recesses of his mind. The gallery had almost cleared, the media now surrounding Emily Carter and her elated family, leaving a stark tableau of the trial's principals in the sudden hush. He dismissed Ada Jenkins with a clipped nod, her face a study in controlled rage, a tempest threatening to break through her professional veneer. He needed to confer with Bell in private. Bell halted a respectful distance away, his countenance inscrutable. The cocky spark Thompson had so frequently observed during the hearings had vanished, replaced by a profound weariness etched into the creases around his eyes. The overhead lights seemed to sharpen the silver threading his hair, adding years to his visage. Thompson tented his fingers, the heavy quiet punctuated only by the tick of an unseen clock. A tremor ran through him, a physical echo of the moral earthquake he was weathering. It wasn't merely the acquittal, monumental as that was. It was the stark realization of his colossal error. He had permitted his biases, prejudices against a disgraced lawyer with a blemished history, to poison his judgment. He belittled Bell, dismissed his arguments, and almost condemned an innocent woman. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the stillness. "Mr. Bell," he began, his voice raspy, a stranger to his own ears. He stood, an unplanned act of deference, and descended the dais, placing himself on equal footing with the man he had so readily condemned. "I owe you an apology." The words felt like gravel, rough and difficult to expel. Apologies were rare currency in his professional life. Judges were meant to embody truth, administer justice. To concede fallibility was to undermine the very foundation upon which he stood. But the alternative was unbearable. Bell remained silent, patient. His gaze, steady and unwavering, held no animosity. Thompson found a strange solace in that. He didn't merit such grace, yet desperately needed it. During this trial, Thompson continued, his voice gaining resonance, I allowed personal sentiments to intrude upon my impartiality. I was dismissive of your reasoning, questioned your motives, and treated you with an arrogance that was both unjust and unprofessional. He paused, searching for the requisite words to convey the depth of his remorse. I was mistaken, Mr. Bell. Plainly, unequivocally mistaken. He met Bell's gaze directly. I misjudged you. I misread the evidence. And I nearly perpetuated a terrible injustice. He swallowed hard, the weight of his failing heavy on his soul. For that, I am profoundly sorry. He scrutinized Bell, anticipating some sign of triumph, of satisfaction. Yet found none. Only a quiet understanding. Bell finally spoke, his tone measured. Apology accepted, Your Honor. The simplicity surprised Thompson. He had anticipated indignation, perhaps even a scathing rebuke. He had steeled himself for a tirade, a deserved condemnation. Instead, Bell offered absolution. Thank you? Thompson murmured, barely audible. A peculiar sense of release unfurled within him, the knot of guilt in his chest loosening. But that ease was tempered by the understanding that his ordeal had only begun. I am cognizant that an apology cannot undo what has occurred. Thompson pressed on. But I want to assure you of my commitment to ensure justice prevails. He hesitated, unsure how much to confide. I intend to launch my own examination of the Carter case. I need to comprehend how this transpired, how the system faltered. Bell inclined his head slowly. I appreciate that, Your Honor. After a brief pause, he added, But I suspect the rot extends beyond a single case. Thompson returned his gaze, comprehension taking root. I believe you are correct, he said gravely. And I intend to ascertain precisely how far. The atmosphere in the courtroom underwent a transformation, lighter, infused with a nascent sense of purpose. The hostility that had previously permeated the space had dissipated, supplanted by a delicate accord, forged in the flames of doubt and contrition. Thompson extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Bell. For everything. Bell grasped his hand firmly. Simply fulfilling my duty, Your Honor. As Bell turned to depart, Thompson felt a surge of hope. Perhaps, even within the flawed machinery of the legal system, redemption remained possible. Perhaps, even a judge could glean wisdom from his errors. He observed Bell's departure, the burden of his responsibilities pressing down on him anew. He had an arduous task before him, sifting through evidence, reviewing testimony, interviewing witnesses. He had to identify where the system malfunctioned, and who bore culpability. He retreated to his chambers, the silence magnifying the tempest within. He settled at his desk, the Carter case file looming like a phantom. He opened it, his gaze sweeping over the documents, searching for clarity. He recalled Ada Jenkins, her ambition ablaze, her unwavering determination to secure victory at all costs. He wondered if she had knowingly introduced spurious evidence, if she had willfully misled the jury. The notion sent a chill through him. He considered the police investigators, their eagerness to resolve the case, their willingness to disregard inconsistencies. He wondered if external pressures had been applied, if they had been manipulated. A growing unease settled upon him. He pictured Emily Carter, her life hanging precariously, her future uncertain. He felt a sharp pang of remorse for his role in her hardship. He was resolved to atone. He lifted the phone and buzzed his clerk. "Compile everything you have on ADA Jenkins," he instructed, his voice resolute. "I want a comprehensive overview of her career, her cases, her connections." He replaced the receiver and leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. He knew he was embarking on a perilous course, one that could expose unwelcome truths and incite powerful adversaries. But the fear had receded, replaced by a firm sense of obligation. He was charged with upholding justice, not only in this instance, but in every matter brought before him. He closed his eyes, resolve hardening his features. He would not rest until he had exposed the truth, regardless of the consequences. He owed it to Emily Carter, he owed it to Marcus Bell, and he owed it to himself. He had been blind, but now his vision was clear. And he would not permit darkness to win. The courtroom might be empty, but the struggle for justice had just commenced. A new beginning. The courthouse steps churned with a frenzy. Camera flashes erupted like miniature lightning strikes, and a thicket of microphones surrounded Marcus, their metallic gleam predatory. He'd anticipated some buzz after Emily's absolution, but this felt like the eye of a storm, bombarded by inquiries and searing light. He winced, navigating the human surge, the stale tang of vending machine coffee lingering on his palate. "Mr. Bell, care to comment on your unconventional methods?" A voice, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the din. "Mr. Bell, reports say you broke free from confinement. Truth or fabrication? How do you rationalize your action? Mr. Bell, champion or outlaw?" He lifted a hand, hoping to quell the rising tide. "Look, I appreciate the attention. But right now, I just want to go somewhere quiet." That word, quiet, felt foreign. He lacked a sanctuary anymore, not in the traditional sense. Just scattered stopovers and the relentless phantom of his past. A woman, shorter than the rest and wielding a voice recorder with determined force, carved a path to the front. Her jaw was set with purpose, and her gaze seemed to dissect him. "Mr. Bell, Brenda Holloway, the City Gazette. You've leveled accusations of malfeasance against the DA's office. Substantive proof, please?" He paused, his gaze locking with hers. There was something unique about her, a genuine curiosity that surpassed the usual media circus. "That's what Judge Thompson is currently assessing," he said, his voice raspy. He uncovered discrepancies. He understands that Emily Carter's predicament was only the visible part of a much larger issue. Brenda Holloway's eyebrows arched slightly. "Judge Thompson? The very same Judge Thompson who oversaw your initial trial?" He nodded, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "The very same. People are capable of evolving, Ms. Holloway. Even those who wear robes. And you, Mr. Bell? Have you undergone a similar transformation?" The question hung, a primed explosive. He hesitated, the weight of his history bearing down. "I'm striving to," he said at last, the words nearly swallowed by the uproar. "I'm striving to repair the damage." He shouldered his way through the press, ignoring the yelled questions and persistent flashes. He needed to escape, to find a pocket of stillness, to digest the events. He couldn't fathom returning to his prior existence. He discovered a relatively tranquil nook a few blocks distant, a compact park where the ancient trees cast mottled shadows. He sank onto a bench, the urban noise a distant thrum, and retrieved his burner phone. It had been buzzing incessantly since Emily's release. The first dispatch came from an unknown contact. "Marcus Bell, your legal prowess is noted. We at Feinstein and Partners wish to explore a potential opportunity. Contact us at your earliest convenience." He scoffed inwardly. Feinstein and Partners. One of the city's most esteemed, most rigidly corporate firms. They'd never spare a glance for a former convict, much less extend an offer. It had to be a jest. The next missive was from the American Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Bell, we were profoundly impressed by your advocacy for Emily Carter. We believe your background and perspective would be invaluable to our organization. Contact us to explore collaboration in our fight for justice. He stared at the message, his pulse quickening. This felt authentic. The ACLU? They genuinely desired him. Throughout the succeeding hours, the messages persisted. Public defender offices scrambling for seasoned trial advocates. Advocacy collectives dedicated to penal reform. Even several dubious figures peddling less than reputable schemes. He experienced a peculiar cocktail of exhilaration and disbelief. After years of being labeled a felon, a pariah, he was suddenly the object of a courtship. The irony stung. It had taken a prison break and a sensational case to finally allow people to perceive him as he truly was, beyond their preconceived notions. He understood that he couldn't embrace just any proposal. He had to exercise restraint, to select a trajectory aligned with his principles, with his burgeoning purpose. He couldn't succumb to hubris. He still faced a steep learning curve, a mountain of proof to offer. As twilight enveloped the city, daubing the horizon with streaks of flame and violet, he received yet another call from an unfamiliar source. He paused before answering. "Hello? Mr. Bell, this is Judge Thompson." Marcus straightened on the bench, his senses heightened. "Judge Thompson. What can I assist you with?" "I wish to express my gratitude, Mr. Bell, for enlightening me, for demonstrating that the system I believed I understood so intimately is flawed." Marcus remained mute, anticipating the inevitable caveat. "I've already initiated the investigation into Ada Jenkins and the lead investigators on the Carter matter." Thompson pressed on. "I've also tasked a team with re-examining your initial conviction. I desire to ascertain whether there were any improprieties there as well." Marcus's breath snagged. "You're reopening my case?" "I'm exerting every effort to ensure that justice prevails, Mr. Bell. For you, for Emily Carter, and for all others who have been betrayed by this framework. That demands courage, Judge. Courage I should have summoned long ago. But it's not too late to begin. I might require your assistance, Mr. Bell. Your insights, your unorthodox approaches." Marcus hesitated, weighing the offer. Partnering with Judge Thompson would be a gamble, an alliance with someone who had previously been his antagonist. But it could also forge a potent partnership, a catalyst for genuine transformation. "I'm in, Judge," he affirmed at last. "I'm in." The following morning, Brenda Holloway awaited him outside his motel. He knew her instantly, the resolute set of her jaw, the spark of intellect in her gaze. "Mr. Bell," she greeted, extending her voice recorder. "A moment of your time?" He sighed. He couldn't evade the media indefinitely. And he sensed that Brenda Holloway possessed a level of integrity, at least enough to report the truth. "All right, Ms. Holloway," he conceded. "What do you wish to learn?" "Everything," she countered, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Commence at the beginning." He recounted his formative years, his aspirations of becoming an attorney, the chain of events that culminated in his unjust imprisonment. He unveiled the corruption he'd witnessed behind bars, the despair and inequity that pervaded the system. He chronicled Emily Carter's plight, his tenacity to vindicate her, the gambles he'd undertaken to expose the facts. Brenda Holloway listened intently, her fingers dancing across her notepad. She posed insightful questions, challenging his assumptions, compelling him to confront the unsettling truths concerning himself and the world. After several hours, the sun had reached its zenith and exhaustion weighed on them both. Brenda Holloway closed her notepad and regarded him, her demeanor serious. "Mr. Bell," she stated, "your narrative is remarkable. It's also profoundly significant. People need to hear this." He nodded. He acknowledged she was correct. He couldn't remain concealed in the shadows any longer. He bore a responsibility to leverage his experiences, his knowledge, to champion justice, to amplify the voices of the unheard. "I'm ready, Ms. Holloway," he avowed. "I'm ready to share my story." Her article dominated the front page of the City Gazette the subsequent day. It served as a blistering indictment of the criminal justice system, a compelling depiction of a man who had suffered injustice and who was committed to rectifying it. The response proved overwhelming. People seethed with anger, found inspiration, and felt energized. They clamored for answers, they demanded reform. The district attorney's office was compelled to launch an internal inquiry. Judge Thompson's probe gained impetus. Marcus Bell transformed into an overnight phenomenon. He participated in national television interviews, received invitations to speak at conferences, and was acclaimed as a hero by some, while branded a criminal by others. Yet, amidst the chaos, he remained grounded, his sights set on his central purpose. He recognized that the attention would be transient, that the struggle for justice spanned a long and arduous path. Nevertheless, he was prepared. He was prepared to employ his voice, his skill set, his accumulated experience to effect meaningful change. He opted to align with the ACLU, attracted by their steadfast dedication to civil liberties and their willingness to challenge the established order. He understood that the road ahead would not be easy. He would meet resistance, opposition, even threats. However, he was no longer gripped by fear. He had discovered his purpose, his calling. He stood ready to wage war for a new era, not solely for himself, but for all those who had been failed by the system. As he stepped into the ACLU headquarters, a building that projected the aura of a fortress of justice rather than a simple office space, he spotted a recognizable figure. Judge Thompson stood near the reception area, engaging in conversation with a woman who remained unfamiliar to Marcus. The judge glanced up, a look of relief washing over his features. "Marcus," he greeted, extending his hand. "A pleasure to see you. I have someone I'd like you to meet."